12 military K9s, trained to obey a single handler, conditioned to ignore every stranger in a room, formation inside a hospital corridor and ran. Not toward a threat, toward a nurse. A nurse the staff laughed at. A nurse the doctors spoke over. A nurse who couldn't finish a sentence fast enough to be taken seriously. They didn't attack her. They surrounded her. All 12. Heads low. Bodies pressed close. Like soldiers who had just found their lost commander on a battlefield they never expected to see again. Nobody in that hospital understood what they were witnessing. Nobody except her. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories on this channel don't go where you expect them to. Every week we bring you cinematic tales of people who got written off, pushed out, and overlooked. And what happened when the world finally had to pay attention. Hit like if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The morning shift at Caldwell Regional Medical Center started the way it always did, with noise that had nothing to do with patients. The break room on the third floor filled up at 6:45, nurses rotating through with coffee cups and half-eaten granola bars, the kind of tired that came not from one bad night, but from several years of them stacked end to end. The fluorescent light above the sink had been flickering since March. Nobody had filed a maintenance request because nobody wanted to be the person who filed the maintenance request. Nora Vasquez was already in the hallway when most of them were still complaining about the light. She moved quickly and quietly, the way she always did, checking IV lines before her actual shift technically began, because there was always something that the overnight crew had missed. Not out of negligence, but out of exhaustion, and Nora understood that distinction better than most. She didn't announce what she was doing. She didn't log it as extra hours. She just did it, the same way she'd been doing it for the 2 years she'd worked at this hospital in Harwick, Montana, a mid-sized city that sat in the shadow of the Rockies and operated under the firm belief that things done quietly were things done correctly. Room 318 had a patient whose potassium drip had been running too fast. Nora adjusted it without waking him, charted the change, and moved on. She was recapping a syringe near the supply cart when she heard Brianna Locke's voice carrying from the nursing station around the corner. Honestly, I don't understand why they even assign her to cardiac. She can barely explain a medication change to a patient's family without turning it into a 10-minute ordeal. Nora didn't stop moving. She'd learned early that stopping gave the impression you were listening, and listening gave people the idea that their words had weight you hadn't already decided to discard. It's not her fault, someone else said. That was probably Diane, who was kind in the way people were kind when they didn't want conflict. She tries. Trying isn't the same as being effective. We had a family in 3 and 12 yesterday who asked to speak to someone else because they couldn't follow what she was saying. A pause. That's a problem, Diane. That's not me being harsh. That's a patient care issue. Nora rounded the corner with a chart in her hand, and both of them went quiet in the particular way that confirmed they knew she'd heard. She set the chart on the station counter. Mrs. Okafor in 312 doesn't need a different nurse, she said. She needs the physician to stop using clinical language when he explains her diagnosis to her family. I flagged that in the notes yesterday. Someone might want to follow up. She picked up her next chart and walked to the elevator. Behind her, she heard nothing. That was fine. She hadn't expected a response. Nora Vasquez had a stutter. It wasn't always severe. On good days, it was barely detectable, a slight elongation of certain consonants, a breath taken in the wrong place, a sentence that required half a second more to complete than the listener expected. On bad days, it felt like her own voice was working against her, catching on words like a door with a warped frame that required extra force to open. She had grown up in Reno, the daughter of a woman who waitressed double shifts and a father she barely remembered. The stutter had shown up when she was 6 and never entirely left. She had done speech therapy on and off for years, enough to manage it, enough to function at a level most people outside the field would call normal. But hospitals were not most places, and the particular culture of medical environments, where authority was communicated through speed and precision and an absolute absence of hesitation, was not kind to anyone who required an extra breath. She had learned to write things down when the stutter was bad. She had learned to deliver the critical information first and let the context follow. She had learned to hold eye contact and let her steadiness carry what her voice sometimes couldn't. What she had not learned to do was pretend it didn't cost her anything. It cost her, every day. In ways she didn't discuss with anyone at Caldwell Regional, because she had also learned that vulnerability in a hospital hierarchy was not met with support. It was met with reassignment. What nobody at Caldwell Regional knew, what nobody in Harwick knew, because Nora had come here specifically because nobody here knew anything about her, was what she had done before nursing school, before the stutter therapy and the BSN degree and the quiet apartment near the river. She had worn a different uniform. She had worked in a different kind of facility. And the patients she had treated there had not been able to tell anyone what she had done for them because her patients at that time had 4 legs and classified records. Woke. Dr. Marshall Croft ran the cardiac unit at Caldwell Regional with the efficiency of someone who genuinely believed that efficiency was a virtue rather than a tool. He was in his early 50s, silver-haired, the kind of doctor who had been respected for so long that he had stopped distinguishing between respect and deference. He was not a bad physician. Nora had observed enough of his work to be clear-eyed about that. He was skilled, experienced, and reliably correct in his clinical judgments. He was also, in the specific way that competent people with unchecked authority often became, deeply certain that his version of a room's events was the accurate one. He called her the quiet one. Not cruelly, at least not intentionally. He said it as though it were a neutral descriptor, like the one with the red lanyard, or the one who takes the east corridor. But in context coming from him, spoken in the doorway of rooms where other staff could hear, it functioned as something else. It functioned as a reduction. She didn't correct him. She had learned that correcting people like Dr. Croft in front of witnesses produced a defensive reaction that made everything harder for everyone, including patients. So she noted it internally, added it to a mental file she'd been keeping for about 8 months, and kept moving. The morning she would remember for the rest of her time at Caldwell Regional started with an incident report. A patient in the step-down unit, a retired postal worker named Gus Fenwick, 67, recovering from a bypass, had reported that his pain medication schedule had been altered without anyone explaining why. He was confused and, more relevantly, he was in more pain than he needed to be. Nora had reviewed his chart at 6:50 in the morning and found that the adjustment had been made the previous night by a third-year resident following a verbal order that had been documented incorrectly. She filed the report at 7:15. At 8:40, Dr. Croft appeared at the nursing station where Nora was updating intake forms. "Did you file an incident report on Fenwick's pain management?" "Yes," she said. He set a tablet on the counter, not aggressively, but with the precision of someone placing evidence. The resident documented a verbal order. She took the half-second she needed. The verbal order wasn't for a reduction, it was for a timing adjustment. The documentation conflated the two. "How do you know what the verbal order was?" "Because Mr. Fenwick told me what he was told, and what he was told doesn't match what was charted." Croft studied her for a moment. "Nora, patient recollection of verbal exchanges during post-surgical recovery is not reliable documentation. I know that, which is why I also pulled the nursing notes from the shift and cross-referenced." She kept her voice even. She had rehearsed this in her head since 7:15. The notes from 11 p.m. referenced the original schedule. The amendment was entered at 2 a.m. without a counter-signature. There's a gap. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll speak to the resident," he said finally. He picked up the tablet and walked away. He did not say she had done the right thing. He did not say he agreed with her. He said he would speak to the resident in the tone of a man concluding an interruption. Nora went back to her intake forms. At 9:30, she was called into the charge nurse's office. Sandra Keel, the charge nurse, was a woman in her late 40s who Nora had never had a problem with, which was different from saying they were close. Sandra was fair in the particular way that people who worked within institutional structures were fair. She followed protocol, she avoided favoritism, and she believed that most problems could be resolved if everyone agreed to be reasonable. "Close the door," Sandra said. Nora closed it. "The incident report on Fenwick. Dr. Croft has concerns." "I know," Nora said. "He told me." Sandra folded her hands on her desk. "He feels the report was, his word was premature, that the documentation issue could have been resolved internally before escalation." Nora looked at her. "The patient was in unnecessary pain." "I understand that. But there's a difference between a documentation error and a reportable incident, and Croft thinks the documentation error caused the unnecessary pain. That makes it reportable. She kept her voice flat and even, not confrontational, just precise. I'm not trying to cause a problem. I'm trying to make sure Gus Fenwick doesn't spend an extra 12 hours in more pain than he needs to be in because a resident made a charting error that nobody wanted to flag. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. I know your intentions are right, Nora, but you have to understand how this reads from a unit cohesion standpoint. When a nurse files incident reports without going through the attending first, the attending is the subject of the oversight question. She breathed. I couldn't go to him first. You could have come to me. It was 6:50 in the morning. Sandra exhaled slowly. I'm not disciplining you. I want to be clear about that. But I'm asking you to consider whether the way you're operating on this unit is working. For you and for the team. Nora understood what she was being told. She had been told versions of it before, in other places, in other offices. The specific words changed. The shape of the conversation did not. She thanked Sandra for her time and left. The call came in at 11:42. Not a patient emergency. Not that kind of call. The kind that came to the administrative line and got routed through 3 departments before landing with the nursing coordinator, who passed it to Sandra, who appeared at the 3rd-floor nursing station with a look on her face that Nora had learned to read as contained alarm. There's a federal K9 unit requesting access to the facility, Sandra said, primarily to the room, not to anyone specific. Military support team. They're doing some kind of regional coordination exercise, and they need medical clearance for the dogs before they enter the building. Apparently one of the handlers has a documented health condition that requires hospital proximity. She looked around. We need someone to coordinate with their team lead and walk them through intake protocol. Brianna Locke immediately said, I can do it. But the nursing coordinator, a quiet man named Tom, who Nora had always respected for his genuine disinterest in hospital politics, looked at Nora and said, You have the military liaison certification, right? From your previous work? She did. It was listed in her file and almost never came up. Yes, she said. Take point on this one. Brianna's expression didn't change, but the air around her did. Nora was already moving. She met the convoy in the east parking structure at 12:15. There were 3 black vehicles, 2 SUVs and a transport van. And the transport van was the one that mattered, because she could hear the dogs before she could see them. Not barking. Something lower, more controlled. The sound of large animals in motion, shifting their weight, aware of an unfamiliar space. The team lead was a man named Marcus Webb. He was tall, somewhere in his 40s, wearing civilian clothes but with the posture of someone who had been told exactly once in his life to stand up straight and had never had to be told again. He introduced himself with a handshake that was firm without performing anything. Webb, he said. You're coordinating for the facility? Vasquez, yes. She didn't elaborate. She'd found over the years that people like Webb appreciated the economy of words over social filler. I have your intake forms. I need documentation on each animal, vaccination records, any behavioral flags for clinical environments, and a handler contact for each unit. He nodded like she'd said something he expected. I've got all of that. We also have a standing federal health protocol for the dogs. If any of them trigger stress indicators in the building, we need clearance to bring them outside immediately, no delay for administrative approval. Understood. I'll note it in the visitor record. She was already writing. How many animals? 12. She looked up briefly. That was a large unit for a coordination exercise. She noted it without saying anything. Webb was watching her with the slightly careful expression of someone who hadn't decided yet whether to ask a question. She had seen that expression before and she knew what it usually meant. It meant he was running a calculation about whether the person in front of him was what their paperwork suggested. She handed him the intake clipboard. Start with the lead handler's documentation and work through the team. I'll verify against your federal authorization while you fill. He took the clipboard. For a half second, as the paperwork transferred between them, his eyes moved to the left side of the van where the door was still closed. From inside, from behind the reinforced transport wall, came a sound. Not a bark, not a whine. A single, short, specific vocalization. The sound a dog made when it had registered something and was deciding whether to respond. Webb's head turned toward it fractionally, then back to the paperwork. Nora was already looking at the van. Well, she had told herself, standing in the east parking structure with the smell of exhaust and mountain air mixing in the concrete shadows, that it was impossible. That she was projecting. That her brain was doing the thing brains did when they were tired and under sustained low-grade stress, reaching for patterns, inventing connections that weren't there. She told herself this specifically because she recognized the sound, not the breed, not the general category of sound, the specific sound, the particular register, the pause in the middle of it, the way it ended without falling, of a dog she had worked with for almost 2 years in a facility she hadn't spoken about to anyone in this city. She kept writing on her intake sheet. Her handwriting didn't change. Marcus Webb filled out the first section of the form and handed it back without comment. The van was quiet again. Nora finished the intake verification in 11 minutes, issued the clearance, and walked Webb and his team through the East Entrance protocol. She explained the restricted corridors, the noise management guidelines for the clinical floors, the emergency egress routes in the event any animal became distressed. Webb listened without interrupting. He asked one precise question about the cardiac unit's proximity to the main corridor. She answered it, and he nodded once. They went inside. The 12 dogs moved through the east entrance in a controlled formation, each one paired with a handler, each one scanning the environment with the particular alertness of animals that had been trained to absorb new sensory data without reacting to it. They were quiet. They were disciplined. They were exactly what she expected them to be. And then the one at the back of the formation, the older one, the one with the gray starting at his muzzle and a slightly uneven gait on the left rear that she recognized with a physical sensation somewhere behind her sternum, that one stopped walking. His handler kept moving for half a step and then felt the resistance and turned. The dog was not looking at his handler. He was looking at Nora. She was standing 6 feet away to the left of the doorframe, with a clipboard in her hands and her eyes on the form she was completing. She felt it before she looked up. The change in the air, the quality of the silence that opened up around her while the rest of the world kept moving. She looked up. 12 years. The dog was 12 years old. She knew because she had been there when he was 4, when he had come into the recovery program with a shattered left rear assembly and a handler who hadn't come back with him, and she had sat with him on the floor of his kennel for 3 hours without speaking until he had finally put his head on her knee and breathed. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her every morning when she had walked into that facility. Not with excitement, not with the performed enthusiasm of a pet, but with the specific recognition of a creature who had decided, a long time ago, that this particular person was worth the effort of paying attention to. Vasquez. Webb's voice was careful. Do you know this dog? She opened her mouth. And the dog. Before she could answer, before she could decide what to say or how to say it, or whether this was a moment that required the truth or a careful version of it, the dog took 2 steps toward her and sat down at her feet in the position she had taught him when he was still learning to trust weight on his left rear leg. Formal. Still. His eyes on her face. The other 11 dogs felt it travel through the formation like a current. One by one, they turned. One by one, they oriented toward her. And the hallway went completely, utterly silent as the entire K9 unit, 12 federal military working dogs in full operational condition, arranged themselves around a hospital nurse with a clipboard and a stutter and a past nobody in this building had ever thought to ask about. Webb stepped forward slowly. "Who are you?" he said. And it wasn't an accusatory question. It was a genuine one. The question of a man who had just watched something happen that restructured what he thought he understood. Nora looked down at the dog at her feet, his gray muzzle, his patient eyes. The way his weight was still, after all this time, distributed slightly more toward the right to protect the leg that had never quite healed the same way twice. She breathed. "I'm the night shift," she said. "I was always the night shift." Webb stared at her. Behind him, through the glass of the corridor window, she could see 3 nurses from the 3rd floor who had come to watch the K9 unit pass through, Brianna Locke among them, mouth slightly open, the particular expression of someone whose internal model of a situation had just been interrupted by a fact that didn't fit. The dog at Nora's feet had not moved. His eyes had not left her face. And in the far corridor, just at the edge of where the fluorescent light gave out, and the shadow of the restricted wing began. The overhead panel flickered once, the same bad light from the break room, or one exactly like it, and something in the quality of the air changed. Not a sound. Not yet. But the dog's ears shifted, and Nora felt it land in her chest before she understood it. The oldest reflex she had, the one she had spent years trying to pack away and leave in a facility 3 states east of here. A reflex that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with the years before it. Something in this building was wrong. The dog's ears didn't move back down. That was the detail Nora fixed on while everything else in the corridor continued its normal rhythm. The distant sound of a cartwheel on linoleum, a PA announcement 2 floors up, Webb's breathing beside her, measured and controlled. The ears stayed forward, angled slightly left, toward the restricted wing where the fluorescent light had just stopped flickering and gone to a steady, neutral hum that was somehow worse than the flicker. She had learned, in the years before this job, before this city, before the careful construction of a life that fit inside the dimensions of a hospital ID badge, that the ears were always more reliable than the bark. The bark was a conclusion. The ears were the thinking. Vasquez. Webb's voice was low. Not alarmed. He wasn't a man who alarmed easily, but calibrated to the register people used when they needed an answer without broadcasting the question. Talk to me. Give me a... She breathed once. Give me a second. She looked at the dog. His name was Rook. She had named him that because when he came into the recovery program, he had moved exactly like a chess piece, straight lines, deliberate, no wasted motion, even before his leg had healed enough to support that kind of precision. He had been 4 years old and missing his handler and operating on pure trained instinct with nothing underneath it but grief. And she had spent 6 weeks teaching him that grief and function were not mutually exclusive. He was looking at the restricted wing. She looked at Webb. What's in that corridor? We were told it was administrative overflow, inactive. Who told you? Facility coordinator. When we did the pre-entry walkthrough this morning, Nora looked at the corridor. The restricted wing at Caldwell Regional was exactly what it sounded like. A wing that had been closed for renovation 14 months ago and had been in a state of suspended half-completion ever since. The kind of institutional stall that happened when budget approvals got tangled in committee. She had walked past it hundreds of times. She had never had a reason to look at it the way she was looking at it now. That wing is supposed to be empty, she said. Supposed to be, Webb repeated, not as a question. Rook made the sound again, the short, specific vocalization from the parking structure, the one that meant he had registered something and was deciding. Then he settled back into stillness, but his weight had shifted forward onto his front legs, and that was a posture Nora knew. That was a posture that meant he had already decided. I need to make a call, Webb said, and he stepped 3 feet away and spoke quietly into a radio she hadn't noticed until now, clipped to his collar in the way federal handlers wore them when they were doing something that looked like a civilian exercise and wasn't entirely. Nora crouched down. Rook looked at her immediately. The gray on his muzzle was more extensive than she remembered, threading back toward his ears now, and there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there when he was 4. Not age exactly, but the particular density that accumulated in working animals who had seen a lot without being able to explain any of it. She put her hand flat on the floor, not reaching for him, just offering the gesture. He touched his nose to her knuckles once. Brief. Certain. She stood back up. Okay, she said when Webb returned. What did they say? They're checking the wing's access log remotely. He paused. There were 2 badge scans this morning, between 4 and 5 a.m. That wing requires a level 3 access badge. Renovation staff don't have level 3. I know. They looked at each other. Behind them, the other 11 dogs had maintained their positions, seated, oriented toward Nora, handlers watching the exchange, with the trained patience of people who had learned not to ask questions in the middle of a developing situation. Brianna Locke and the 2 other nurses were still visible through the corridor window, but Nora had stopped being aware of them as a factor. They had receded into the background noise of a place she was suddenly looking at very differently. I have to report this to the charge nurse, she said. Before you do. Webb reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document. Not dramatically, just efficiently. He unfolded it and held it up without handing it over. Our clearance for today isn't just a health coordination exercise. We're operating under a federal support order for a protected individual currently admitted to this facility. I can't tell you who or where. What I can tell you is that the restricted wing is directly adjacent to the floor they're on. Nora stared at the document for 2 seconds. You knew there was a security element to this visit, she said. We knew it was a possibility. The primary purpose was genuine. Hendricks, one of my handlers, has a cardiac arrhythmia and needed proximity clearance. But we were also asked to have eyes on the building layout. Who asked? He refolded the document. That's the part I can't tell you. She wanted to push on it. She didn't because she understood operational compartmentalization, and she understood that pushing on it would cost them both time neither of them had. I need to call Sandra Keel, she said, my charge nurse. She needs to know about the badge scans. Agreed. Make it fast and keep it quiet. Sandra Keel answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Nora had always respected about her. When Nora finished, there was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to indicate that Sandra was not going to reflexively minimize what she'd been told. 2 badge scans at 4 a.m., Sandra said, confirmed by the federal team's remote check. The wing hasn't had authorized access since the renovation contract lapsed in February. I'm going to call facilities. Call security first. And, Nora paused, chose the next part carefully. Don't route it through the standard admin line. The federal team has a protected individual in this building. I don't know who or where. If the badge scans are connected to that, you want the information staying inside a small channel. Another pause, longer this time. Nora, what exactly is happening down there? I don't know yet. I'm telling you what I know and what I think you should do with it. How confident are you in the federal team? Their lead is credible. She glanced toward Webb, who was speaking quietly with 2 of his handlers. Their dogs flagged the corridor before any of us did. She could hear Sandra's breathing shift, the specific exhale of a person recalibrating their understanding of a situation. Give me 5 minutes, Sandra said. Thank you. She hung up. The next hour moved in that compressed, hyper-aware way that certain hours moved, the kind where ordinary time bent under the weight of something wrong that hadn't yet announced itself. Nora stayed in the East Corridor with Webb's team and watched the facility continue around them, its routines intact, its staff moving between floors and departments with the comfortable obliviousness of people who had no reason to look for anything. She had spent most of her professional life in environments where the gap between apparent calm and actual threat was something you measured in seconds, and she had spent the last 2 years deliberately forgetting how to measure it. The measurement came back to her now with a speed that was almost embarrassing. Not gradually, not with effort, but like a physical reflex, the way your hand closed around a falling object before your brain had processed that it was falling. Dr. Marshall Croft appeared at 12:54. He came from the stairwell rather than the elevator, which meant he'd been on a floor that didn't have direct corridor access to the East Wing, which meant Sandra's call had pulled him from somewhere he hadn't expected to be interrupted. He was in his clinical coat, and he was walking with the energy of someone who had been told something that fell outside his normal categories and was working to fit it inside them by sheer institutional authority. He looked at the K9 unit. He looked at Nora. He looked at Webb. What's going on? He said, and he said it to Webb, not to Nora. Webb said, Dr. Croft? Yes. Marcus Webb, Federal Coordination Unit. We have a potential access anomaly in your restricted wing. Your charge nurse is coordinating with your security team. We'd appreciate if staff movement in the East Corridor could be limited for the next... He checked something on his wrist device. 20 minutes while we get confirmation. Croft looked at the 12 dogs. He looked at Nora again with an expression she recognized. The expression of a man reconfiguring a hierarchy he'd thought was settled. You're the liaison for this? He said to Nora. Yes. Since when do you have military liaison clearance? Since about 6 years before I started working here. He stared at her. It wasn't a hostile stare. It was the specific look of someone who had built a mental model of another person and was now encountering a data point that didn't fit inside it. She had seen that look before. She found she had less patience for it than she usually did. It's in my personnel file, she said, not unkindly. Under prior experience. He didn't respond to that. He turned back to Webb and said, What kind of access anomaly? Badge scans on a restricted wing at 08400. We're checking against your facility access log. Rook made a sound. It was quiet, barely audible. But Croft heard it because everyone within 10 feet heard it, and the sound of a military working dog making any vocalization in a hospital corridor was the kind of thing that reorganized your attention involuntarily. Rook was looking at the restricted wing door. His ears were flat forward. His tail was low and still. Nora's hand moved to Webb's arm before she'd consciously decided to move it. "That's an alert posture," she said. Webb was already on his radio. What happened next happened fast, and Nora processed it in the particular fragmented way that fast things were processed. Not in sequence, but in images, each one burning in clearly and then giving way to the next. Webb's two lead handlers moved toward the restricted wing door. Rook stood from his sight position without being commanded, his body aligned precisely with the door. And Nora noted with the cold, separate part of her brain that monitored things clinically that the unevenness in his left rear gate had not worsened. If anything, it had smoothed, the way old injuries sometimes did when an animal was in full operational mode and the body's priorities reorganized themselves around the task. Croft said, "We should wait for security." Webb said, "We are security." The wing door opened from the inside. A man in gray maintenance coveralls came through it pushing a supply cart. The cart was the standard aluminum kind, the sort that moved cleaning equipment between floors. He had a badge clipped to his chest pocket, and he walked with the practiced neutrality of someone who expected to be unremarkable. He saw the K9 unit. His pace didn't break. That was the tell. Well, not the acceleration that you'd expect from someone guilty, but the deliberate maintenance of a normal rhythm, which was something normal people never had to deliberately maintain. Rook made no sound. He stepped forward. He sat down directly in the man's path. The man stopped. "Sir?" Webb's voice was calm and absolute. "Can I see your access badge?" "I'm just doing my rounds." The man's voice was even. "Supply restocking for the East Wing renovation." "That wing's been under a renovation hold since February," Nora said. The man looked at her for the first time. She watched his eyes calibrate, taking in the blue scrubs, the nursing badge, the clipboard she was still holding, and arriving at the conclusion that she was not the primary threat in this corridor, which was a mistake she had seen people make before and had learned to leave uncorrected. "Badge," Webb repeated. The man reached for his chest pocket. His hand moved to the badge and then, fractionally, barely, continued moving past it, toward the upper left interior of his coverall. Rook moved. Not violently. He stood from his sight and closed the distance between himself and the man's left side in 2 steps, not touching him, just positioning. 300 pounds of trained working dog standing at precise contact distance, his body angled to close off the left interior of the coverall from any hand that was trying to reach it. The man went completely still. "Left hand out," Webb said. "Slowly, palm up." The man complied. His right hand was still near the badge. "Right hand," Webb said. It came out empty. 2 of Webb's handlers moved forward and took position on either side. The man did not resist. He went into a kind of rigid non-resistance, the posture of someone who had calculated options and found them insufficient. When they opened the supply cart, it took Webb about 4 seconds to look at its contents and reach for his radio. He spoke into it for 12 seconds. He used words that Nora understood, but that she was fairly certain Dr. Croft did not. The specific operational language of federal coordination, call signs and location codes, and a priority tier that meant the next vehicle arriving at this facility would not be ambulances. Nora stood with her clipboard in the east corridor and looked at the cart's partially visible contents and felt something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite satisfaction, and was maybe the specific feeling of having been right about something you desperately wished you'd been wrong about. Croft was standing 5 feet behind her. She could feel his presence without looking. "What's in the cart?" he said. "I don't know exactly," she said. "But whatever's in the restricted wing is what matters. That's where he came from." "How did you know?" She looked at him. He was asking a genuine question, not defensively, not rhetorically, but with the specific confusion of a man trying to reconstruct a sequence of events that had unfolded around him without his participation. "I didn't," she said. Rook did. Croft looked at the dog. Rook had returned to his position beside Nora. He was seated, ears tracking the man who was now being held against the corridor wall by two federal handlers. His posture, the calm, permanent-looking stillness of an animal that had completed a task. "The dog," Croft said. "He flagged the corridor before we had any other information. I read the alert posture. We notified your charge nurse. The rest followed." "You read the—" He stopped. Started again. "How do you know how to read military K9 alert postures?" She had known this question was coming since the parking structure. She had known it the way you knew a weather system was moving in. Not the exact timing, but the certainty. "Because I spent 4 years working with them," she said, "before nursing school." Sandra Keel arrived at 1317 with the head of hospital security, a compact man named Gerald Oates, who moved like someone who had done crowd control in a former life and still thought in those terms. Behind them were two Caldwell regional administrators, whose names Nora didn't know, but whose expressions she recognized. The specific look of institutional leadership encountering a situation that their crisis protocol did not adequately cover. Webb met them in the corridor and had a conversation that Nora was not part of, standing 4 feet away from it, which was the appropriate distance. She was a nurse. She was a liaison. She was not an agent of whatever federal apparatus Webb operated under, and she understood the perimeter of her role clearly enough not to push past it. What she was doing, while the adults in charge had their conversation, was watching the restricted wing door. It was closed again. 2 of Webb's handlers were positioned outside it, and 2 Caldwell security staff had joined them. Unnecessary doubling, but Oates was the kind of man who would always double the post. Fine. It was fine. What she was watching was not the door. It was the light above it. The standard hospital indicator light, the kind that illuminated green when a room was clear and red when it was occupied. What was green? It had been green this whole time, which meant that either the indicator light was malfunctioning or whoever had accessed the wing had been in there long enough and knew the system well enough to keep the indicator defaulted to clear. That required either significant technical knowledge of Caldwell Regional systems or access to someone who had it. She looked at the cart. She looked at the maintenance coveralls. She looked at the badge, which was still clipped to the man's chest pocket while he was held against the wall. A Caldwell Regional Facilities badge with a photo that she could just make out from here, and a name that she could not. She walked toward him. Not quickly, not with any performance of purpose. She walked the way she walked when she was moving between patient rooms, with the ordinary momentum of someone who belonged where they were going. She stopped 3 feet from him. The handlers looked at her but didn't stop her. She was the liaison. She had clearance. She read the badge. The name on it was Douglas Fell. The photo on it was a man who looked roughly similar to the man currently being held against the wall. Similar enough that a quick visual check would pass. Not similar enough that a deliberate one would. She looked at the man's face. She looked at the badge photo. "That's not your badge," she said. The man said nothing. "The photo's off. Lighting's different too. This badge was printed at a different facility than our standard issue. The coloring on the Caldwell logo is slightly wrong." She kept her voice completely even. "I've looked at our badges every day for 2 years. The blue is a specific shade. That badge is printing a slightly different one." Webb was beside her now. He looked at the badge. He looked at her. "How—" he started. "I notice things," she said. "It's generally considered one of my less useful qualities around here." She stepped back. Webb reached for his radio again. The restricted wing yielded what it yielded, and Nora was not in the room when it did. She was back at the nursing station, filing a contemporaneous incident report, writing down every timestamp and observation in the sequence they had occurred because that was what you did, and because the habit was so deeply built that it operated independently of whatever else she was feeling. What she was feeling, underneath the operational steadiness, was something she hadn't expected. It wasn't vindication exactly. It was more structural than that. It was the feeling of having operated correctly in a situation that mattered and having done it with the exact set of skills that this hospital had spent 2 years treating as irrelevant. The stillness, the observation, the ability to read a creature's posture and extract from it a signal that nobody else in the building would have known was there. She finished the report at 14:08. At 14:15, Brianna Locke came and stood near the nursing station with a coffee she wasn't drinking and a look on her face that Nora had not seen her wear before. "Is everything okay?" Brianna said finally. "Down there. Security's handling it." Were you, were you actually the one who... She stopped, restarted. The federal guy, Webb. He said the dogs flagged something and the liaison coordinated the response. He said it before I could ask him what that meant. She paused again. Were you the liaison he was talking about? Yes. Brianna looked at her coffee cup. I didn't know you had a military background. I know. I didn't know that was... I didn't... She stopped a third time. She was not a person accustomed to not finishing sentences, and the experience seemed to be uncomfortable for her in a way that Nora recognized from the inside. I said some things this morning about you being slow to explain things. I heard you. I know you heard me. Brianna's voice was quieter now. I'm not going to pretend that I knew what you'd been doing before, but I'm also not sure that's... I don't know. No, I don't know if that's actually the point. Nora looked at her. There was a version of this conversation that she'd had in her head before. The version where acknowledgement came too late and too conveniently, and she dismissed it. She found, standing here with an incident report still warm from the printer, that she didn't entirely want to dismiss it. It's not the point, she agreed, but it's part of it. Brianna nodded, slowly, in the way of someone absorbing something they weren't entirely sure they deserved to understand yet. She left without another word. Webb found her at 15:30 in the small family consultation room near the east elevator, where she had retreated to finish a secondary piece of documentation and eat half a granola bar that she'd had in her pocket since morning. He knocked on the open door frame before entering, which she appreciated. Got a minute? Sit down, she said. He sat. He had the slightly different quality that people had after something resolved. Not relaxed, but decompressed. The operational tension metabolized into something more ordinary. The wing's been secured, he said. I can't tell you everything that was in there, but I can tell you it was significant. The individual we had in the facility has been moved to an alternate location as a precaution. He paused. Your read on the badge saved us probably 2 hours of access log cross-referencing. The badge was sloppy, she said. If they had better equipment, it would have taken longer. Maybe, but you saw it in 3 seconds. She didn't respond to that. Your file, Webb said, and there was a careful quality to the words now, the care of someone who had done a lookup in the last 2 hours. The work you did at Fort Hawthorne, that's still partially sealed. I could only access the summary tier. She had known this moment was coming too. In the same way she had known about Croft's question, about Brianna's coffee cup apology, about the particular shape of what happened when a past you had packed away arrived in your present without an invitation. Yes, she said. 4 years. 3 years, 10 months. K9 trauma recovery, classified program. He was reading it from memory, she realized. He'd read it well enough to hold it. You were the primary handler substitute for animals that had lost their operational partners. She looked at her granola bar. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the kennels at night, and the animals that paced, and the ones that stopped eating, and the ones that had been trained to work alongside a specific human being, and then found themselves in a world where that human being was not coming back. She thought about what it took to become, for an animal like that, sufficient. I stayed, she said finally. When it was difficult. I stayed, and eventually they decided that was enough to start working with again. She folded the granola bar wrapper. It's not a very complicated method. It just requires more time than most people are willing to give. Webb was quiet for a moment. Rook, he said. He was in your program. His handler died in a training accident during my second year. He came to us completely shut down. Wouldn't eat for 11 days. She kept her voice clinical. It was easier that way. We got him back. He's been operational for 7 years since then. I know. He's the best animal on my team. Arguably the best animal I've worked with in 15 years. She didn't say anything. I want to know, Webb said, and the careful quality was gone from his voice now, replaced by something more direct. What you're doing in blue scrubs in a mid-sized hospital in Montana when you have a record like this. The question sat in the room. Nora looked at the consultation table between them, at the box of tissues on the corner that was always slightly empty because no one replaced them in time, at the motivational print on the wall that she'd looked past 100 times without seeing. I made a call, she said. In the program. A recommendation about an animal's behavioral status before a joint operation. I said the dog wasn't ready. She paused. Nobody listened. The operation ran. The dog's handler was injured. Webb said nothing. I know the math on that, she said. I know that a dozen other decisions contributed. I know the handler recovered. I know the after-action report didn't cite my recommendation as a primary factor. She looked at him. I still left, because I had told them exactly what was going to happen, and they had looked at me and waited for me to finish my sentence and then proceeded as if I hadn't spoken, and I couldn't figure out how to go back to that building every day and trust that any of it mattered. The room was very quiet. So I became a nurse, she said, and I came here, and I thought that was probably the end of a particular chapter. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, the after-action report was amended 14 months after it was filed. There's a supplemental finding. I read it in your file summary. She went still. The supplemental finding, Webb said, cites a pre-operation behavioral assessment that was not acted upon. It doesn't name you specifically because the summary tier doesn't include names, but it's there. She had not known that. She had left before it was filed. She had made it a specific practice not to look back at Fort Hawthorne's records, because looking back was a form of hope she had decided she couldn't afford, and hope left unpacked too long became something else entirely. Nora, Webb said, and it was the first time he'd used her name directly. I need to file my incident report from today. I need to include a full account of the civilian liaison's role in the access anomaly identification. He paused. That report goes to federal oversight. It will be attached to your existing Fort Hawthorne file summary. She understood what he was telling her. She understood it clearly and completely, and she felt it move through her the way very cold water moved. Not painful, but absolutely undeniable, the kind of sensation that forced acknowledgement whether you wanted to give it or not. Okay, she said, I'll need your service record number. She gave it to him from memory, because some numbers you never forgot, the same way you never forgot a dog's kennel ID or the specific sequence of sounds that meant an animal had crossed from distress into something more dangerous. Webb wrote it down. One more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Federal letterhead, a number, his name in the plain type of government documents. There's a program. It's new. Civilian Military K9 Trauma Consultation. They're still building the framework. He set the card on the table. They've been looking for someone with your specific combination of skills for about 8 months. She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. She breathed. I'm a nurse, she said. You're a nurse who just identified a federal access breach because a dog she'd worked with 8 years ago remembered her posture. He stood up. You can be more than one thing, Vasquez. He left. She sat with the card on the table in front of her for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She knew because she was watching the clock on the wall, the one with the slightly fast second hand that had been slightly fast since March, the same way the light had been flickering since March, the same way this hospital had been operating at a slightly wrong frequency since she'd arrived in it, and she had accommodated all of it without ever asking why. She picked up the card. She did not know what she was going to do with it. That felt important to acknowledge. She had made the mistake before of knowing what she was going to do and acting on the knowledge before the full situation had revealed itself. And the cost of that mistake had been measured in years and geography and a very deliberate amnesia about who she had been before blue scrubs and fluorescent lights, and people who finished their sentences while she was still trying to start hers. But she put the card in her pocket, and she was still sitting there, running her thumb along its edge, when the door of the consultation room opened again. Not Webb this time, not Sandra, not Croft with his recalibrating expression, but Rook, who had apparently been left unattended in the corridor for approximately 4 minutes and had used that time to push open a door with a handle he had been trained to operate, and was now standing in the threshold of the family consultation room, looking at her with the absolute patience of an animal that had waited 8 years and found the wait to be a reasonable investment. She looked at him. He sat down, and from somewhere above them, from the floor the protected individual had just been evacuated from the floor where the badge scans had originated, from somewhere in the structure of this hospital that was not finished revealing its complications, came a sound that was not normal, not an alarm, not a voice, a single metallic impact, the kind made by a door that had been opened by someone who hadn't wanted to use the handle. Rook's ears came forward. He did not look at the door. He looked at Nora, and she was already standing up. She didn't waste time on the hallway. The sound had come from above, one floor up, maybe two. The kind of impact that traveled through institutional walls and arrived stripped of its source. Just the fact of it. The metallic certainty that something had moved that wasn't supposed to move. Rook was already at the door of the consultation room, his body angled toward the east stairwell rather than the elevator. And she trusted that without deliberating about it because she had learned a long time ago that deliberating about what the dog already knew was the most expensive mistake you could make in a fast-moving situation. She went to the stairwell. Rook went with her, not ahead, not behind, beside her, his shoulder at her left knee, the contact position that handlers used with animals in active operational mode, the one that meant stay with this person, match this person, don't break from this person regardless of what you encounter. No handler had told him to do that. He had simply done it. She pushed through the stairwell door and heard it immediately. Voices above her, 2 levels up, the staccato exchange of people who were not having a planned conversation, not shouting, something more controlled than shouting, which was worse. She took the stairs fast, 2nd floor landing, cardiac wing, Croft's territory, the floor where Gus Fenwick was still recovering from a bypass, and where the incident report she'd filed that morning felt, from this distance, like something that had happened in a different week. She kept going. 3rd floor landing, and the stairwell door was not fully latched. It had been closed but not latched, and that was wrong because hospital stairwell fire doors had pneumatic closers that brought them fully home every time. And the only way a door like this was left unlatched was if someone had come through it quickly and recently and had been more focused on moving than on the sound behind them. She pushed it open. The 3rd floor corridor was the overflow administrative wing, the one above the restricted renovation area, the one Webb had been told was inactive. It was supposed to be empty. What it was, in fact, was a corridor with the overhead lights set to half power and 2 people at the far end of it who were not supposed to be there. One of them Nora recognized immediately, Pauline Rast, one of the day administrators, a woman in her late 50s who managed facility access credentials and sat in the 2nd floor admin cluster and had, as far as Nora had ever been able to tell, no reason to be on the 3rd floor of the overflow wing in the middle of a federal security event. The other one she didn't recognize at all. I was taller than the man from the restricted wing downstairs. Different build, different coveralls, though the coveralls were the same gray-green color, and he was holding something against his chest that was not immediately identifiable from 40 feet away in half-power light, except that it was rectangular and flat, and he was holding it with the specific care of someone carrying something fragile or incriminating. Pauline Rast saw Nora first. Her expression did something complicated. Not surprise, not guilt, not quite fear, but a specific combination that Nora recognized because she had seen it before in people who were not fundamentally dangerous, but who had made choices that had placed them in dangerous company and were now standing at the point where the consequences of those choices had become physically visible. Nora, Pauline said, and her voice had an unusual quality. Too even. You shouldn't be on this floor. I know, Nora said. She kept walking toward them. Not fast, not aggressive, the walk of someone who had every reason to be where she was. What floor should I be on? Rook was at her left knee and had not made a sound. The man in the coveralls looked at Rook and something shifted in his posture. The specific recalibration of a person who had planned for a set of obstacles and was now encountering one that wasn't in the plan. I'm going to need you to leave this floor, he said. His voice was professional. Not threatening, not yet, but with the texture of someone who is accustomed to being listened to. I'm the federal liaison for the security team currently operating in this building, Nora said, so I'm going to need you to show me what you're carrying. A beat. Pauline said, It's a facilities matter, access credential archiving. I'm doing a transfer. Pauline. Nora looked at her directly. Stop. The woman stopped. Not because Nora had said it with force, because she had said it with the specific quality of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and was offering one moment of grace before the next thing happened. I've worked with you for 2 years, Nora said quietly. You process every access credential in this building. You printed that badge downstairs, didn't you? Pauline's face did the thing that faces did when the calculation collapsed. It wasn't... She stopped. I didn't know what it was for. I was told it was for a new contractor who hadn't gone through standard onboarding yet. I was told there were time constraints. Who told you? The man in the coveralls moved. Not toward Nora. He moved toward the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor, the west stairwell, which Nora had not come from, which meant he had already identified his exit and was moving to it the moment the conversation stopped being useful to him. Rook moved faster. He crossed the corridor in 4 seconds, not running. Military working dogs didn't run at a target without a command. They moved with the precise acceleration of an animal that had learned to cover distance without telegraphing what it was doing. And he put himself between the man and the west stairwell door with his body fully perpendicular to the man's path. The man stopped. Rook sat down. He was looking at the man with the absolute patient focus of an animal that had been bred and trained and worked for a decade to make exactly this kind of statement with its body. I am here. You're not going anywhere. This is not a negotiation. Give me the thing you're carrying, Nora said. She had her radio in her hand. Not Webb's federal system, just the standard Caldwell Regional Staff radio, the one that reached security and the charge nurse line. She didn't raise it yet. And then we're going to stand here until Commander Webb comes upstairs. The man looked at her. He looked at Rook. He looked at the distance between himself and the stairwell door and made the calculation that she could see him making, and the calculation came up wrong, and he knew it came up wrong. And he held the rectangular object out in front of him and set it carefully on the floor and straightened up with his hands visible. Nora pressed the call button on her radio. Webb came up the west stairwell, 6 minutes later with 2 handlers and Gerald Oates from hospital security, and a federal agent in plain clothes who had apparently been in the building since 9 a.m. and whom Nora had walked past at least twice without identifying, which bothered her more than she let show. The rectangular object was a portable hard drive. Specifically, it was a portable hard drive containing, as Webb's team would later determine, approximately 4 years of Caldwell Regional Facility access records. Every badge scan, every credential issuance, every visitor log, time-stamped and indexed. It was the operational history of an entire hospital's security architecture. In the wrong hands, it was a map of every person who had ever been admitted, transferred, or protected within these walls. Webb looked at the hard drive in its evidence bag. He looked at Nora. How did you get up here? He said. Rook, she said. He heard the impact from 2 floors down. He wasn't supposed to be unsupervised. I know. He pushed a door open. Webb looked at the dog. Rook looked back at him with the expression of an animal that understood it had technically violated a protocol and had decided that was an acceptable trade. Who's the woman? Webb said, indicating Pauline, who was now seated on the floor against the corridor wall with Oates beside her, not restrained but clearly not going anywhere. Pauline rasped. She manages access credentials for the whole facility. I think she was the inside source for the badge that was used downstairs. Nora paused. I don't think she understood the full scope of what she was part of. That's for the investigation to determine. Yes, I know. I'm just telling you what I think. Webb looked at her with the expression he'd had in the consultation room, the one that was still recalibrating. You should go back to your floor, he said. I know. She went. What? The next 4 hours at Caldwell Regional moved in the way that institutional time moved after a significant event. Too fast in some corridors and too slow in others, with pockets of absolute surreal normalcy, where patients needed their vitals checked and medications dispensed, and family members needed someone to explain what a troponin level meant, and the entire apparatus of ordinary care continuing its orbit around an extraordinary center. Nora worked her shift. She checked Gus Fenwick's pain medication, correctly administered now, his chart updated and countersigned, and she sat with him for 4 minutes while he told her about a dog he'd had as a kid, a German Shepherd mix that had followed him to school twice and once all the way to the bus stop before his mother caught up to them both. She listened without performing listening. She answered his questions about his recovery timeline honestly, including the parts that were uncertain, because patients deserved honesty about uncertainty more than they deserved false confidence. She went back to the nursing station. Dr. Croft was there. He was not seeing a patient. He was standing near the chart rack with a coffee cup, which was not his normal behavior at this hour. And when she sat down at the documentation terminal, he moved slightly, not walking away, just adjusting his position, the way people adjusted their position when they wanted to be available for a conversation without initiating it. She let him stand there for 2 minutes. Then she said, without looking up from the terminal, "Did you need something, Dr. Croft?" "The incident report from this morning," he said. "The one about Fenwick." "Yes. I spoke to the resident. You were right about the documentation gap." A pause. "I should have looked at it more carefully before I came to you." She kept typing. "Okay, that's..." He stopped. "I'm trying to say something." "I know. I dismissed the report before I reviewed it. That was wrong." She looked up at him. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands and looking at a point on the wall past her left shoulder, which was the specific geography of someone who was saying something they hadn't said many times and wasn't sure where to put their eyes while they said it. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." He nodded once and walked away. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was a revision. She had learned the difference between those two things early, and she had learned that sometimes a revision was more durable. Sandra called her into the charge office at 5:47. The federal agent in plain clothes was there. His name, he said, was Garrett Fole, and he was with a federal oversight body whose specific designation he gave once and clearly, and which Nora noted and filed. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the particular kind of tiredness that wasn't about sleep. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, "I've been briefed on your role in today's events. I have some questions, and then I have some information." "Okay." "The individual in the restricted wing, the one your dog identified." "Not my dog," she said. "The one Rook identified," he corrected without hesitation, which told her he'd been briefed thoroughly. He had been in that wing for approximately 11 hours. He accessed it using a credential issued by your facility's access administrator at approximately 0340 this morning. He was there to retrieve the hard drive that was later found on the 3rd floor. Why was the drive on the 3rd floor? Pauline Rast moved it. Apparently she was told it was routine archival material and that a pickup would be arranged. She didn't know what was on it. He paused. "We believe she knew the credential she issued was irregular but did not know the full operational picture." "That's consistent with what she said upstairs." "Yes." He looked at his notes. "The protected individual who was in this facility, whom you were not informed of and whose location was not shared with you, is connected to a case that's been active for about 14 months. The individuals who accessed this building today were trying to establish the individual's location through the facility's badge access history, which would show what floor and what room they'd been admitted to. They couldn't get the records through the system directly. The system has federal encryption on its protected individual records, but the raw badge scan logs, those are stored locally on the facility's own archive hardware. Less protected." He paused. "It's a gap that your facility's IT security team didn't flag because it's a gap that requires someone to already know the protected individual was here, which means there's a separate information leak we're still tracking." Sandra said very quietly, "Someone told them a protected individual was in this building." "Yes," Fole said. The room held that for a moment. Nora looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the circle of people who would have known a protected individual was admitted to Caldwell. Regional was not large, and that it included people with administrative access to the facility's protected records, and that Pauline Rast was not the only person in that circle. "Ms. Vasquez," Fole said, "the Fort Hawthorne supplemental finding that was added to your service record 14 months ago. Were you aware of it before today?" "No." "Commander Webb informed you today?" "Yes." "How do you feel about that?" It was a strange question for a federal agent to ask, and she said so. "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She thought about it. She gave him the truth rather than the composed version of it. "I feel like I spent a long time not looking at something because I was afraid of what I'd find, and it turns out what was there was different from what I expected. I haven't decided yet what to do with that." He nodded. "The report I'm filing from today's event will reference your service record and your specific role in both the corridor identification and the 3rd floor intervention. It will be attached to the existing Fort Hawthorne file." He closed his notebook. "I want you to know that's not incidental. There are people who will read that report who have been looking for a reason to revisit that file for some time." "What kind of people?" "People who run programs that need what you have." He stood. "That's all the information I have for you right now." He left. Sandra sat across from Nora in the small office and said nothing for a moment. Through the window, the Caldwell Regional parking structure was visible, and the space where the three black vehicles had been was now empty, the convoy having departed sometime in the late afternoon. The dogs returned to their transport van, the federal apparatus folded back into itself and gone. Except for Rook, who was, according to the last radio communication she'd had from Webb, being held at the east entrance for a final handler check and would depart within the hour. "Nora," Sandra said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't have to. I'm going to give it to you anyway, so let me." Sandra had her hands flat on the desk. Not the folded posture of that morning's difficult conversation, but open, which was different. "I told you this morning that I was worried about how you were operating on this unit. I told you to consider whether your approach was working. And I meant it as professional concern, but the honest version of it is that I had absorbed other people's impatience with you and dressed it up as management." Nora said nothing. The incident report on Fenwick was correct. The documentation gap was real. You were right, and I redirected you instead of backing you up. And I did that because Croft made it easier to redirect you than to push back on him. She exhaled. "That's not the charge nurse I'm supposed to be." "It was one incident," Nora said. "It was a pattern. I've been watching it happen for 2 years and calling it unit cohesion." The fluorescent light above Sandra's desk hummed. It was steady. This one had always been steady. Not the break room light, not the flickering one. Nora had never particularly noticed it before. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." Sandra nodded. "Go see the dog before they leave." She found Rook at the east entrance at 6:23. His handler, a young woman named Doss, one of the quieter members of Webb's team, was running through the post-operation check with him, moving through the standard assessment, joints, pause, coat, responses. Rook tolerated it with the dignified patience of an animal that understood the procedure and found it neither interesting nor offensive. Webb was there too, speaking on his phone, and he saw Nora and lifted 2 fingers in acknowledgement without breaking the call. She crouched down to Rook's level. Doss looked at her and then at the dog and moved back half a step, which was a courtesy Nora appreciated. Rook looked at her. She put her hand flat on the floor. He touched his nose to it, then moved his head and rested his muzzle across the back of her hand, which was not a trained behavior. That was something else. She held very still and let it be what it was. "You did good today," she said. "You did She breathed. "You did really good." His eyes stayed on her face. 8 years. The kennels at Fort Hawthorne. The 11 days he hadn't eaten. The morning he'd finally walked to the food bowl without being coaxed, and she had been across the kennel pretending not to watch. And she had let herself feel 1 solid minute of something that was not quite happiness, but was in the same family. She stood up before she let herself feel too much. Webb had finished his call. He came over and extended his hand, and she shook it. "The program I mentioned," he said, "Civilian Military K9 Trauma Consultation. The coordinator's name is on the back of the card." "I have the card." "Call within 2 weeks. After that, the position goes to a different kind of search." "Okay." Nora. He said it the same way he had in the consultation room, so direct, no preamble. "What happened at Fort Hawthorne with the pre-operation assessment? The supplemental finding doesn't just say the assessment wasn't acted upon." She waited. "It says the assessment was correct, specifically. The behavioral indicators you identified in the animal were later confirmed by the post-incident review as the primary contributing factor." He met her eyes. "You called it exactly right. They knew that 14 months later, and they documented it, and then your file sat in a sealed status because nobody connected it to a name because you were already gone." The east entrance automatic doors slid open for a moment. A family coming through from the parking lot, a woman with 2 kids, the small chaos of an ordinary hospital arrival, and then slid closed again, and the evening quiet returned. She had known it, in some part of herself that she hadn't let speak very loudly. She had known the way you knew things you couldn't afford to act on. Hearing it said out loud in a hospital corridor by someone who had read it from a federal document was an entirely different thing. "Thank you," she said. Webb nodded once and walked back to his team. She stood at the east entrance and watched Rook load into the transport van with the careful, deliberate movement of an older dog who knew exactly how to manage his body on an incline. Doss helped from behind, one hand under his haunches, steady, not rushing him, and Rook accepted it without looking back. The van door closed. She went back to her floor. The evening shift started at 7, and Nora stayed for the first 2 hours of it because there were 3 outstanding charts, and because staying gave her something to do with her hands, while her brain ran its own separate process, sorting through the events of the day with the methodical compulsiveness of a system that didn't know how to stop once it started. At 8:40, she was alone at the nursing station. The floor was quiet. 3 patients stable, 1 being discharged in the morning, the break room light still flickering every 4th or 5th cycle over the door to the staff area. She'd stopped noticing it at some point, probably, the same way she'd stopped noticing a lot of things that had been wrong for a long time. She was reaching for her jacket when her personal phone buzzed. Not a hospital contact, an unknown number with a Denver area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. The day had been long and specific, and she was already full. She answered it. "Ms. Vasquez." A woman's voice. Precise, not warm, but not cold. The specific register of institutional authority that had some relationship with competence. "My name is Colonel Adria Sten. I'm the program director for the Interagency K9 Medical Consultation Program out of Denver. Commander Webb called me this afternoon." Nora said nothing. "I understand you've had a full day," Sten said. "I'll be brief. We've been running a civilian specialist search for 8 months. Webb says you identified an operational alert from a dog you haven't worked with in 8 years, through a transport vehicle, from a parking structure, before any electronic detection flagged anything. He told you that. He wrote it in his field report, which I read about 40 minutes ago." A pause. "I want to meet with you, in person, this week, if possible. She stopped, breathed. "I'm a nurse. I have a schedule. I know what you are. I also know what you were. And I know what the supplemental finding says, and I know that Fort Hawthorne ran a program for 4 years that produced results. Nobody has been able to replicate since you left it." The voice was still precise. "I'm not calling to flatter you. I'm calling because we have 12 working animals in our Denver facility that haven't responded to any handler substitute protocol in the last 6 months, and 2 of them are at the point where their continued operational status is under review, which in practice means—" "I know what that means," Nora said. She knew exactly what that meant. "Yes," Sten said. "I thought you might." Nora was standing at the nursing station with her jacket in her hand and the break room light doing its irregular thing through the door, and somewhere below her in the east parking structure there was an empty space where 3 black vehicles had been. And somewhere on a federal hard drive there was a supplemental finding with her methodology in it and no name attached. And she was holding a phone in her hand and feeling the specific, terrifying weight of a door that had been closed for a long time, opening in a direction she hadn't expected. "Denver," she said. "Thursday," Sten said. "I'll send the address." Nora looked at the empty corridor, at the flickering light, at the chart rack with its ordinary stack of ordinary human need. "I can't give you an answer tonight," she said. "I'm not asking for one tonight." A pause. And for the first time in the conversation, something shifted in Sten's register. Not warmer exactly, but more specific. "Ms. Vasquez, those 2 animals I mentioned, one of them hasn't eaten consistently in 3 weeks. The nursing station was very quiet. Nora closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Send me the address," she said. She hung up. She put her jacket on. She was walking to the elevator when her radio crackled. Not Webb's federal channel, not the security line, just the standard Caldwell regional staff frequency. And Gerald Oates' voice came through with a quality she hadn't heard from him before. "All available staff to the 4th floor. We have a situation in the cardiac recovery wing." She pressed the elevator button. The 4th floor was Croft's territory. Cardiac recovery. Gus Fenwick's floor. The floor where the pain medication chart had been wrong that morning, where she had filed the report before 6 a.m., where the resident had made a documentation error that she had caught and flagged and been called into Sandra's office for flagging. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The radio crackled again, and this time Oates' voice had something underneath the professionalism, something thin and urgent that made the hair on her arms move. "We have an individual in the cardiac wing who is not staff and is not a registered visitor. We have a patient who has been moved from their room." The elevator doors closed. Nora looked at the panel. She pressed 4. And as the elevator began to rise, the specific calculation she had been making for the last 8 hours, The one about doors and choices, and what she was, and what she had been, and whether those two things could exist in the same life, completed itself in a way that felt less like a decision and more like a recognition. Someone had taken a patient, and the one person in this building who understood exactly how this day had been constructed, each layer of it, the badge, the drive, the coveralls, the careful misdirection, was standing in an elevator going to the fourth floor with a radio in one hand and 8 years of deliberately forgotten expertise suddenly and completely and irrevocably available. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. The corridor was wrong in 3 separate ways that she saw simultaneously, and she was already moving before the doors had fully parted, and somewhere behind her from the stairwell she'd left open came the sound of paws on concrete, measured, deliberate, closing fast. Rook had not been in the van. The 3 things wrong with the corridor presented themselves in sequence, fast enough that her brain processed them as a single perception, but distinct enough that she cataloged each one separately as she moved through the elevator doors. First, the nursing station at the end of the 4th floor corridor was unmanned. Not temporarily. The chair was pushed back at the angle of someone who had left in a hurry, not rotated away for a routine task. The monitor screens were active. The coffee cup on the left side of the station was on its side, liquid spread across the desk surface and dripping off the edge, still moving. Second, the door to room 412. The room she knew from 2 years of shift patterns was the largest single occupancy room on this floor, the one they used for high-acuity post-cardiac patients who needed additional monitoring equipment, was standing fully open. The rooms on this floor were never left fully open. The protocol was cracked or closed, depending on patient preference, but never the flat-open geometry of a door that had been pushed aside by someone moving through it quickly. Third, the emergency call light above room 409 was lit, and had been lit long enough that the indicator had cycled from its initial alert red to the secondary pulsing amber that meant the initial call had not been answered within the response window. Someone in 409 had pressed their call button, and nobody had come. She went to 409 first because the unmanned station and the open door in 412 were already bad, and the patient in 409 was a known quantity. She checked her mental map of the floor and pulled up the admission. 71-year-old woman, named Harriet Voss, admitted 2 days ago for observation following an arrhythmia episode, stable but anxious, the kind of patient who used the call button appropriately and not excessively. She pushed 409's door open. Harriet Voss was in her bed, upright, both hands gripping the bed rail, her face the specific color of someone whose heart was doing something it wasn't supposed to do. Harriet started. "I'm here," Nora said. "I see the light." She was already at the bedside, 2 fingers on Harriet's wrist, her eyes on the monitor. The rhythm was irregular, not catastrophically, not the jagged chaos of a full arrhythmia event, but the stuttering irregularity of a heart that had been startled into a pattern it was trying to correct. Stress response. What happened? A man came in. Not my doctor. He wasn't in scrubs, he was in, I don't know, he had a badge, but it wasn't the right color. Harriet's breathing was too fast. He went into the room across the hall. He had someone with him. I heard someone saying, "Stop, please stop." "Okay." Nora was already on her radio. "Oates. 4th floor, room 409. I have a cardiac patient in acute stress response. I need a nurse on this room right now. And I need to know where your people are in relation to room 412. Oates' voice came back with the compressed quality of someone managing multiple channels. "I have 2 security staff on the 4th floor stairwell landing. They entered at the west end. I have no visual on 412. Get them to 412, fast." She looked at Harriet. "You're going to be okay. I need you to breathe slowly. Can you do that?" "The person he had with him," Harriet said. "It was a patient. They were in a gown." Behind Nora, from the corridor, came the sound of paws on linoleum. She turned. Rook was in the doorway of room 409. His handler Doss was 8 steps behind him, slightly out of breath, with the expression of someone who had spent the last 15 minutes trying to contain an animal that had made a decision she couldn't override. Behind Doss was Webb, moving fast, his radio already in his hand. "He wouldn't load," Doss said, which was the most abbreviated version of what had clearly been a significant event. "He got back out of the van. I've never seen him. He's never done that." It's okay, Nora said. He's right. She pointed Rook toward the corridor and said, Find. She had not said that word to him in 8 years. It was a Fort Hawthorne command, specific to the recovery program's search protocol, not a standard military K9 command. She had used it with him when an animal in the adjacent kennel had gone missing during a facility evacuation drill, and he had found it in 4 minutes. He went immediately. No hesitation, no confirmation. He turned and moved into the corridor with the flat-footed, deliberate speed of a dog who already knew where he was going and was simply now authorized to go there. Webb looked at her. Stay with the patient, he said. She looked at him. She looked at the corridor where Rook had gone, and at the open door of 412 visible from this angle, and at the dripping coffee on the unmanned nursing station desk. No, she said. He held her gaze for 1 second and then said, Stay behind me. Oh. Room 412 was empty. Not in the way that an empty hospital room was empty. Stripped of its normal signals, bed stripped, equipment retracted. It was empty the way a room was empty when it had been emptied quickly, the bed still in its upright monitoring position, the IV pole displaced 3 feet from its normal location with the line still attached to nothing, a pole dangling, the cardiac leads disconnected and draped over the bed rail rather than properly stowed. Gus Fenwick was not in his room. Nora looked at the IV setup and calculated from the line placement that the disconnection had been done deliberately but not expertly. Someone who knew what an IV line was and how to remove it, but who had not done it under clinical conditions before. There was a small blood smear on the bed rail where the cannula had been pulled rather than withdrawn cleanly. He would be ambulatory. Barely. He was day 4 post-bypass, which meant his sternum was held together with wire sutures, and every breath was a managed discomfort, and the idea of him being moved quickly through a hospital corridor made something in her chest tighten with a clinical precision that was separate from anything personal. He can't move fast, she said to Webb. He's 4 days post-bypass. His sternum? I know, Webb said. If whoever took him is moving him quickly, we have a serious physical risk. I know. He was on his radio again. She listened to the exchange, clipped, technical, the federal frequency, and pulled from it that there were now 4 additional personnel in the building, 2 at each external exit, that the east stairwell camera had captured a 30-second gap at 8:32 p.m. that matched a known camera interference technique, and that the vehicle access log at the south parking entrance showed a service van that had entered at 8:15 and had not exited. The van was still here. Rook had gone toward the west stairwell. Or they found them in the basement. Not the main basement, not the pharmacy and the morgue and the mechanical systems, the basement that had regular foot traffic and its own security rotation. The sub-basement. The level below that, accessible only through a service corridor that connected to the west stairwell at the B2 landing, a level that housed the building's primary electrical systems, and the original hospital infrastructure that predated the current facility's renovation by 30 years. Nora had known the sub-basement existed because she had once helped coordinate a facility's emergency involving a burst pipe that had required access to the main water shutoff down there. And she had stood at the B2 landing and watched 2 maintenance staff navigate its layout and had noted, with the specific observational habit she could not turn off, that it had 2 entry points and no external exits, and that the internal HVAC system created a noise floor that would absorb a significant amount of sound. It was, in other words, a place that someone familiar with the hospital's infrastructure would know about. Someone like Pauline Rast, who had managed facility access credentials for 6 years, and whose database of building knowledge would have included every room, corridor, and subsystem in Caldwell Regional's layout. She was there. Pauline Rast was in the sub-basement standing next to the service van, which had been driven in through the loading bay access, a detail nobody had flagged because loading bay access was logged separately from the main parking system. And she was standing with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it had done on the 3rd floor, the complicated expression of a person who was no longer certain of the ground they were standing on. Beside her was a man Nora recognized. Not from today. Not from any interaction in this hospital's professional life. From a photograph. From a Fort Hawthorne personnel file she had reviewed 8 years ago when she was trying to understand the command structure that had overridden her behavioral assessment and authorized an operation she had told them was not ready to run. His name was Roland Speer. He had been a logistics coordinator at Fort Hawthorne during her time there. Not a commander, not an operational lead, logistics, which meant he had known the schedules, the animal assignments, the handler rotations, and the specific documentation pathway for behavioral assessments, including hers, including the one that had been not acted upon. He was in his mid-50s now, heavier than the photograph, wearing civilian clothes, and he had one hand on Gus Fenwick's arm, not gripping, exactly, but positioned in the way that communicated control to the person being held without communicating it to an observer at distance. Gus Fenwick was standing with his hand pressed flat against his chest, which was the specific posture of a post-bypass patient managing sternal discomfort through pressure, and his face was the color of old concrete, and he was upright through what Nora recognized as the particular stubbornness of a man who was not going to give someone the satisfaction of watching him fall. Rook was at the bottom of the B-2 landing stairs, seated, looking at Spear. He had not barked. He had not moved toward anyone. He was simply present, in the way that a locked door was present. Not aggressive, just conclusive. Webb came down the stairs behind Nora. Two of his handlers fanned out to either side. Spear looked at the room's new configuration and did the same calculation the man in the maintenance coveralls had done upstairs, ran the options, found them insufficient, and his hand dropped from Gus Fenwick's arm. "There he is," Nora said, and she wasn't speaking to Webb. She was speaking to the specific version of this moment that she had not let herself imagine for 8 years, because imagining it had required believing it was possible, and believing it was possible had required a kind of hope she had decided she couldn't afford. Spear looked at her. "Vasquez," he said. He said it with a flatness that could have been recognition or could have been performance. She couldn't tell, and it didn't particularly matter. "Go to him," Webb said to Nora, indicating Fenwick. She went. She reached Gus Fenwick in 8 steps and put her hand on his wrist immediately. Pulse, rhythm, rate. And then looked at his face with the clinical inventory she ran on every post-surgical patient she assessed, reading the indicators in sequence, coloring, respiration, the set of his jaw, the way he was breathing through his nose in the controlled pattern of someone managing pain. "I'm okay," he said. "You're not okay," she said. "But you're stable. Can you tell me if anything—" "They didn't hurt me." His voice was tight. "They said they just needed me to come with them, that it was a security matter." He looked past her at Spear. He knew my name. He knew what floor I was on. She filed that and moved on. "Does your chest feel different than it did this afternoon? Tighter, sharper, different kind of pressure?" It's the same as it's been, maybe a little more, from the walking." "Okay." She kept her hand on his wrist. His pulse was elevated but not alarming. The sternum pressure from exertion was expected and manageable. He was, by some margin, going to be fine, physically. The rest of it would take longer. "I'm going to get you back to your room. You're going to sit down for a while, and someone is going to check your surgical site and your vitals, and you're going to eat something terrible out of a plastic container." Despite everything, he made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "The nurse nobody listens to," he said. "That's what Harriet next door called you. She said you were the only one who actually looked at her when she talked." Nora kept her eyes on his pulse. "Harriet's got good taste," she said. Webb's people had Spear in a position of controlled custody within 4 minutes of the sub-basement confrontation, not formally arrested, because Webb's federal authority operated in a specific lane that required a separate process for formal arrest, but contained, documented, and separated from any possible exit. Pauline Rass sat on a loading bay crate with her face in her hands and said nothing, which was the appropriate thing to say. Oates arrived with 2 security staff and took custody of the logistics, and the hospital began the process of managing what had happened in the particular way that institutions manage serious events, with the protective bureaucratic instinct that kicked in when liability and responsibility and narrative all needed to be organized simultaneously. Nora got Gus Fenwick back to the 4th floor. She checked his surgical site herself, documented the post-incident vital signs, updated his chart with a precise contemporaneous account of his condition on her arrival in the sub-basement and his condition on return to the ward, and she did all of this with the specific focus of someone who understood that the clinical documentation of a patient's well-being was not a formality. It was a record that would matter, in ways she couldn't fully anticipate yet, to people she hadn't met. Fenwick held her wrist when she was done. Not hard, just held it. "Thank you," he said, "for coming down there." "I was already in the elevator," she said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. His eyes were tired and clear, and he was the kind of man who said what he meant and didn't dress it up, which was a quality she had always found easier to be around than its alternative. "I know," she said. "You're welcome." She went back to the nursing station. It was Webb who explained the shape of it to her at 9:47 in the family consultation room that was becoming the unofficial debrief location for whatever this day was. He had a coffee that was too hot to drink yet, and he was leaving it alone on the table with the patient discipline of someone who had learned not to rush things that weren't ready. Roland Speer had been Fort Hawthorne's logistics coordinator during Nora's tenure. After Fort Hawthorne, he had moved into private sector consulting, the specific gray market kind that involved former federal employees and institutional knowledge and arrangements that were never fully documented. The case that had brought a protected individual to Caldwell Regional was connected to a contracting fraud investigation that had been running for 14 months. The contracting fraud was connected to military service providers. The military service providers included, at several degrees of separation, logistics consulting firms that Speer had been affiliated with. He hadn't come to Caldwell Regional today because of Nora Vasquez. He had come because the protected individual inside it was a witness to something that would, if it reached a federal courtroom, dismantle a network that Speer had been part of building for a decade. "He knew you were here," Webb said. "When our convoy arrived this morning, one of the things we recovered from the restricted wing was a facility staff roster. He'd flagged your name." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because your name was in the supplemental finding on the Fort Hawthorne file. He knew the supplemental finding existed because he's the one who made sure the original assessment was buried." Webb wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He didn't know the finding had been amended. I thought your record still read the way it had when you left, which was, from his perspective, the most useful version." "A nurse with a failed assessment and no recourse," she said. "Exactly. If today had gone wrong, if the protected individual's location had been compromised, if there had been an incident in the facility, he had a version of events ready that would have pointed at the internal security gap and the civilian liaison who had documented access to restricted areas." She understood it completely, and she found that she was not surprised, which was itself a kind of information about what she had always, at some level, suspected. "He buried the assessment," she said, "at Fort Hawthorne. It wasn't just that nobody listened. Someone actively made sure it didn't travel." "That's what the investigation is going to establish formally," Webb said. "But based on what we found in the restricted wing, yes. The documentation of your assessment was altered before it reached the operational command level. The original was flagged as a junior staff notation and deprioritized. The amendment that came back 14 months later, someone filed that independently, a program auditor who was doing a routine review and found the discrepancy. Speer didn't know it had been filed. 8 years. She had carried the weight of a call she'd believed had been heard and ignored. She had built an entire life around accommodating the possibility that she had been simply wrong, that her read on the animal had been a junior error, that the command had seen something she hadn't, that the stubbornness of her certainty had been a flaw in her rather than an accurate signal. It had been accurate. It had always been accurate. She didn't cry because she was in a consultation room in a hospital at the end of a 14-hour day, and she was not built for public emotion in institutional spaces, and also because what she was feeling was not the kind of thing that resolved into tears. It was larger than that and less clean. The feeling of a structural weight you'd been compensating for so long that when it was removed, your whole body had to recalibrate. "Okay," she said. Webb looked at her. He didn't try to fill the space with anything, which she appreciated. "Okay," she said again. At 10:15, Dr. Marshall Croft came to the 4th floor. He was not on call. He had come in from outside. He was still in the jacket he'd have worn to whatever he did on Tuesday evenings, something personal that she'd interrupted by existing in the sequence of events she'd spent the day existing in. He came to the nursing station and he looked at the situation. The security staff still visible near the west stairwell, the tape on the sub-basement access door at the end of the corridor, the federal agent Foale speaking quietly with Oates near the elevator bank. And he looked at Nora. "Fenwick," he said. "Stable. He's going to be sore tomorrow because of the exertion, but the surgical site is intact and his rhythm is normal. He's sleeping. Croft nodded. He looked at the security tape. He looked at Fole. He looked back at Nora. Someone took my patient, he said. It was a flat statement. Not a question, not an accusation, just the fact of it, said aloud by a man processing what the fact meant for the parameters of his understanding of his own domain. Yes, she said. And you went and got him. I was already in the elevator. Croft looked at her with the expression that had been developing over the course of the day, the one that had started as recalibration and had moved through several stages and was now something else, something that had given up the performance of authority and was just looking at her directly. I've been a physician for 23 years, he said, and I have never... He stopped. I have never been as wrong about a person as I have been about you. She said nothing. She let that sit. That's not a comfortable thing to say, he said. I want to be clear that I know it's insufficient. It's not insufficient, she said. It's just not the end of something. It's more like She breathed. The beginning of a different set of choices. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. It is. He went to check on his patient. Garrett Fole found her at 11 p.m. near the east stairwell, which had become her default location for things she needed to process while maintaining the physical appearance of simply being somewhere between places. Spear, he said, without preamble. I know who he is, she said. I know you do. I want you to know that we knew he was in the periphery of this case. We didn't know he had flagged your name or that he had any connection to your Fort Hawthorne record until this evening. He paused. I want to be direct about that because you deserve to know where our intelligence gap was. She appreciated the directness enough to receive it without deflection. What happens to him? He's going to be remanded for federal questioning. What happens after that depends on what the investigation establishes. But the Fort Hawthorne documentation, the original assessment, the alteration, the supplemental finding, that's going to be part of the case file. Your name is going to be in it. I know. Is that okay? It's more than okay, she said. Yes, it's okay. Fole nodded. He had his notebook out and she watched him write something that she couldn't read from the angle and didn't try to. One thing I want to ask, he said. Rook, the dog. He wasn't loaded in the van when the fourth floor radio call came in. No. His handler says he got out of the van and stood at the hospital entrance, that he wouldn't move and wouldn't respond to the load command. That's what she told me. Has he done that before? In your experience? She thought about it honestly. Rook at 4 years old, refusing to enter the East Kennel because something in there had frightened him, and no handler had understood what it was until she had gone in and found a carbon monoxide detector malfunction that would have been a serious problem within the hour. Rook at 4.5, stopping midway through a training exercise and sitting down, immovable, until the trainer had reviewed the scenario plan and found a calculation error that would have put 2 handlers in a dangerous position. Yes, she said. Twice that I know of. Both times he was right. Both times he was right. Fole wrote something else. There are going to be people in the review of this case who want to understand how a civilian nurse with no active federal clearance was the primary identifier in 2 separate access breaches in the same facility on the same day. I didn't identify the breaches, she said. I noticed things that led to identification. That's different. Ms. Vasquez. He looked up from his notebook. That is the same thing. She didn't argue with that. She left the hospital at 11:47. The parking lot was cold. October in Harwick had a way of arriving before October technically arrived, the temperature dropping 15 degrees between sunset and midnight, the mountains visible to the west in the kind of dark clarity that only came when the air was absolutely empty of humidity. She sat in her car for 3 minutes without starting it. She thought about Spear in federal custody somewhere in this building. She thought about Pauline Rast, who had made a choice without understanding its full architecture and was now sitting inside the consequences of it. She thought about Fole's notebook and Webb's card and Colonel Sten's voice on the phone saying one of them hasn't eaten consistently in 3 weeks. She thought about the supplemental finding, the auditor who had filed it 14 months ago and whose name she would probably never know, the anonymous procedural act of a person doing their job correctly, that had produced a document sitting in a sealed file that had just, today, been opened. She started the car. She was 3 blocks from the hospital when her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text from a number she now had in her contacts. Webb. It said, "Rook's in the van. He loaded fine this time. He waited for you to leave the building first." She stopped at a red light. She looked at the message. She thought about an animal that had learned, years before anyone had taught him anything else, that the particular person it had chosen to trust was worth the cost of waiting. She thought about what it meant to be that kind of thing to a creature who had no language for it, only behavior, only the clean and unambiguous logic of showing up. The light turned green. She drove. And somewhere in the part of her mind that was already thinking past tonight, past the incident reports, and the federal files, and the conversation she was going to have with Sandra, and the one she was going to have with Colonel Sten, a question was forming. Not fully formed yet. Not ready to be looked at directly, but present. Not whether to call Denver. She had already answered that. The question was what she was going to say when she got there, what she was going to ask for, what she believed she was worth now that the document existed and the record was intact, and the weight she'd been carrying under the assumption that she'd been wrong had turned out, after 8 years, to have been the exact precise weight of being right and being told otherwise by people who had needed her to be wrong. She turned onto her street. Her apartment windows were dark. She was reaching for her keys when her phone buzzed again. Not Webb this time. An email. Caldwell Regional Medical Center. Administrative sender. Time-stamped 11:52 p.m., which meant someone had been working late in an office she didn't normally interact with, and had sent something that arrived in her inbox with a subject line she read twice before she believed it. Formal review request. Nursing staff performance assessment. Vasquez N. She sat in her car in the dark and opened the email. It was not from the administrative office she expected. It was from the office of Caldwell Regional's chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Helena Price, whom Nora had seen exactly 3 times in 2 years and never directly interacted with. The email said, "Ms. Vasquez, I have received a full briefing on today's events from both our internal security team and the federal coordination officer on site. I have also reviewed your personnel file, including the clearance documentation and prior service record. I would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. There are several matters I would like to discuss, including some that have been brought to my attention regarding how your role at this institution has been managed. It was professional. It was careful. It was the language of someone in a position of authority who had been handed an uncomfortable picture of their own institution and was in the process of deciding what kind of leader they were going to be about it." She put the phone in her pocket. She got out of her car. She was almost to her door when she stopped, because the email had been from Dr. Price, and Price had said several matters, plural, specific, and had referenced not just today but how Nora's role had been managed, which meant Price had read something in the personnel file beyond the clearance documentation. Something about the incident report from that morning, maybe, or the pattern of redirections, or the 2 years of being the nurse. Nobody listened to in a building that had, apparently, according to a federal investigation, needed someone exactly like her more than it had ever known. But that wasn't what made her stop. What made her stop was the timestamp. 11:52 p.m. The email had been sent 18 minutes ago, and Spears' federal processing had been logged, according to Foles' earlier radio communication, at 11:41 p.m., which meant Price had sent that email 11 minutes after Spear was in custody. Which meant someone had told her there in those 11 minutes something about Roland Spears' connection to Nora's Fort Hawthorne file. Someone had specifically briefed Caldwell Regional's chief medical officer on the relationship between a federal detainee and a nurse on her staff within 11 minutes of the detainee being processed. Nora stood on her front step in the October cold. That was not a standard federal briefing timeline. That was someone making a deliberate and immediate decision to put that information in front of the person at the top of this institution's hierarchy before the night ended. She turned that over. She thought about Fole and his careful notebook. She thought about Webb and the card and the 2-week window and the call she had already decided to make. She thought about the supplemental finding and the auditor and the 14 months and all the accumulated, unasked-for architecture of a situation that had been moving toward this specific night for longer than she had known. She unlocked her door. She went inside. She sat down at her kitchen table in her coat and she looked at the wall for approximately 90 seconds before she reached for her phone and opened her contacts and found the number Colonel Sten had called from and typed a single text. Thursday works. Send the address. She sent it. She was still looking at the screen when a second email arrived from Caldwell Regional, not from Price this time, but from the HR administrative system, auto-generated, the kind of email that required a specific manual initiation in the system to produce. It was a formal notification that her personnel file had been flagged for administrative review, not disciplinary. The flag code in the header, which she had learned to read during her first month at Caldwell Regional because she read everything she could access about any system she was required to navigate, indicated the specific review category reserved for personnel files that had been identified for reclassification, upward reclassification. Her phone was quiet in her hands. Outside, the mountains were invisible in the dark, present and enormous, and completely indifferent to whatever was happening in the apartment below them, which was exactly the right amount of perspective. She took her coat off. She was going to sleep. She was going to sleep, and in the morning, there was going to be a floor full of patients who needed vitals checked and medication schedules verified and family members who needed someone to look at them when they spoke. And she was going to do all of that exactly the way she had always done it, which was carefully and without announcement and with the full weight of everything she had learned in every room she had ever worked in. And then, at some point that had not yet been scheduled, she was going to drive to Denver. What she did not know, what she would not know until morning, when Sandra Keel arrived at 6:45 with 2 cups of coffee and a look on her face that meant something had happened in the hours between Nora leaving and the building reopening for the day shift, was that Roland Speer had made a statement during his federal processing, a statement that named names, not just in the contracting fraud case, in Fort Hawthorne, specifically in the documentation pathway for a behavioral assessment filed by a junior specialist in the K9 recovery program, and specifically regarding who had given the instruction to deprioritize it, and specifically regarding what that person had known about the mission the assessment pertained to, and why making the assessment disappear had been, for that person, a matter of significant personal and financial urgency. It was a statement that would, when it was fully processed, not just amend a record, it would indict one. Sandra arrived at 6:43. Not 6:45, which was her normal time, 6:43, which meant she had left her house earlier than usual, which meant she had not slept well, which meant the thing she was carrying had been keeping her up. She had 2 cups of coffee from the place 2 blocks from the hospital, the independent one that opened at 5:30 for the medical staff who needed something better than the break room machine, and she set one in front of Nora at the nursing station without ceremony. Nora had been there since 6:15. She had not intended to arrive early. She had intended to arrive at her normal time, do her normal pre-shift review, and then deal with whatever the morning brought in sequence. What had actually happened was that she had woken at 5 and lain in the dark for 40 minutes, and then accepted that her body was not going to participate in the fiction that this was a morning like other mornings, and she had gotten up and driven in. The floor was quiet. Night shift had 3 patients, all stable, and the nursing station had the specific hush of a space that hadn't fully woken up yet. Sandra sat down across from her. Speer made a statement, Nora said, last night during processing. Full called me at 5 a.m., Sandra said. He wanted me to hear it from the department before the administrative briefing. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He named a deputy program director at Fort Hawthorne, a man named Gerald Vane, who was Speer's operational contact inside the military command structure. Vane had financial interests in the contracting network that Speer was protecting. The behavioral assessment you filed 8 years ago. If it had traveled up the chain correctly, the operation would have been halted. The operation failing would have triggered a safety review. The review would have found the contracting irregularities 2 years earlier than they were eventually found. She paused. So Vane told Speer to make the assessment go away. Speer altered the documentation before it reached the operational command level, and then they both assumed the issue was closed. Nora drank her coffee. It was good coffee. Better than the break room machine, which was always a low bar, but sometimes the low bar was the relevant one. Vane retired 4 years ago, Sandra said. Full honors. He has a pension. He has a standing invitation to speak at program graduations. She said this in the tone of someone reporting facts that tasted bad. He gave a speech 2 years ago about the importance of listening to every team member regardless of rank. Nora said nothing. Foale says the statement creates grounds for a federal fraud indictment. Military contracting fraud, evidence tampering, obstruction. They've been trying to build a case around the contracting network for 14 months, and Spear's statement apparently fills in a gap that their documentary evidence couldn't close. Sandra looked at her directly. Vane is going to be indicted, Nora. It's not a certainty, but Foale put it at a high probability. And Spear? Cooperate witness status, which means he's making a deal, which means he gets something lighter than he deserves. Sandra's voice was flat about that. That's how it works. I know how it works. They sat with it for a moment. Price wants to meet with you at 9, Sandra said, and I want to prepare you for that, because she's going to say things that are going to be hard to hear in a particular way. What kind of hard? The kind where someone is doing the right thing, but the right thing comes a long time after the wrong thing, and the gap between them doesn't just disappear because someone finally decided to acknowledge it. Nora looked at her. You're telling me to be patient. I'm telling you that Price is not Croft. She's going to take responsibility for what happened in this institution, and she is going to mean it. And that's genuinely different from the version of this conversation that ends with someone explaining why the circumstances were complicated. Sandra paused. I'm telling you because I want you to know, going in, that it's real, so that you don't protect yourself out of receiving it. Nora thought about that. She thought about the practiced armor of 2 years of being in a place that had consistently measured her wrong, the specific defensive posture you developed when you learned that acknowledgement was usually a setup for the next dismissal. Okay, she said. Also, Sandra said, Gus Fenwick asked about you at 5:30 this morning. He told the night nurse he wanted to say something to you before his discharge today, and he wanted to make sure someone wrote it down that he'd asked. Nora looked at her coffee cup. He's a good man, she said. He is, Sandra agreed. Dr. Helena Price's office was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that Nora had walked past many times and entered exactly once before, for the standard new hire administrative meeting that every nurse attended, and that functioned primarily as an opportunity for institutional leadership to appear to know who their clinical staff were. Price was in her early 60s, with the bearing of someone who had been navigating institutional complexity for long enough that she'd stopped fighting the complexity and started using it. She was not warm in the way that people who performed warmth were warm. She was direct, and in Nora's experience, directness was more useful than warmth in almost every situation that actually mattered. She had Nora's personnel file open on the desk when Nora came in. She gestured to the chair across from her without preamble. I've read everything, Price said. Your clearance documentation, your Fort Hawthorne service record, including the supplemental finding, the incident reports from the last 2 years, the notes from your conversation with Sandra yesterday morning, and Foale's and Webb's field reports from yesterday's events. She paused. I'm telling you what I've read because I don't want you to have to wonder what I'm working from. Thank you, Nora said. The incident report you filed on Mr. Fenwick yesterday morning, the one that Dr. Croft characterized as premature. Yes. It was correct. I know. The pattern I'm seeing in your file over 2 years is of accurate clinical judgment being filtered through a layer of institutional friction that had nothing to do with the quality of the judgment. Price said this carefully, not as an apology, as a finding. The friction was about your speech, about the speed at which you delivered information, about the perception, by some of your colleagues, that pace and clarity were equivalent when they are not remotely equivalent, and anyone in clinical medicine should know better. Nora kept her hand still in her lap. I should have reviewed this sooner, Price said. That is my failure as an administrator, and I want to say it directly rather than embed it in qualifications. She closed the file. I'm also aware that saying it directly now, after yesterday, is less impressive than it would have been 6 months ago. I know that. It still means something, Nora said. Price looked at her. I want to formalize your liaison role, she said, not as an add-on to your nursing duties, as a distinct function. Caldwell Regional is going to apply for designation as a federal medical coordination site. Yesterday's events have accelerated a conversation that was already happening at the administration level. If that designation comes through, we'll need a permanent civilian federal liaison on staff with active clearance. She paused. You would keep your nursing role if you wanted it. This would be an addition. Nora stopped, breathed. I've been in contact with a federal K9 consultation program out of Denver. I may be taking on a consultancy role there. I know, Price said. Colonel Sten's program. She called me at 7 this morning. Nora stared at her. Sten wanted to know whether Caldwell Regional would support a shared arrangement, whether we'd be willing to accommodate a schedule that allowed you to work here in a reduced clinical capacity while maintaining the consultancy. Price's expression was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. She was very direct about wanting you available to Denver. I told her we had a competing interest in keeping you in Harwick. You told her that. I told her we'd been underutilizing a significant asset and intended to correct that. Nora looked at the wall behind Price's desk. There was a photograph there, a mountain landscape, the kind that was in every office in Harwick because the mountains were available and impressive and people put impressive things on walls. She had looked past it in her one previous visit to this office without registering it. This morning she saw it clearly. I haven't accepted Sten's offer, she said. I know, she said Thursday. I need to understand what it is before I accept it. Of course. Price folded her hands on the closed file. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, this institution would like to be part of it. Nora thought about what Sandra had said, about not protecting herself out of receiving something real. I'll let you know after Thursday, she said. That's all I'm asking. She went to see Gus Fenwick at 10. He was dressed for discharge, street clothes, a plaid flannel shirt in the way of a man who had a type and had committed to it, his discharge paperwork stacked on the bedside table with the careful organization of someone who took paperwork seriously. His daughter was there, a woman in her late 30s who had her father's directness and had clearly been crying recently but was not currently crying, which was the particular equilibrium of someone who had moved through the fear and come out the other side. There she is, Gus said when Nora came in. How are you feeling? Like I had heart surgery 4 days ago, and then someone made me walk to the basement. So? He shrugged carefully. About what you'd expect. His daughter looked at Nora with an expression that was layered, gratitude, and underneath the gratitude something that was still working through its own processing. He told me what happened, she said, last night. All of it. Your father was very calm under the circumstances, Nora said. He's always calm, his daughter said. It's incredibly annoying. Gus smiled at his hands. She gets the worrying from her mother. Nora sat on the edge of the chair near the bed. The clinical part of her visit was already complete. She'd reviewed the discharge summary before coming in, confirmed the medication list, verified the follow-up appointment. This was the other part, the part that didn't have a procedural name. You asked to say something to me, she said. Gus looked at her. The directness again. The specific quality of someone who had arrived at an age where the performance of things felt like a waste of time. I've been in this hospital 4 days, he said. I've had a lot of time to watch how this place works, who people listen to, who they don't. He paused. The morning you filed that report about my medication, I heard the conversation at the nursing station. I wasn't asleep. Old men in hospitals are almost never as asleep as people think. She said nothing. I heard what that doctor said about your report being premature. He looked at his hands. I should have said something then. I was tired, and I told myself it wasn't my business how they talked to each other, and that's the wrong call, and I've been carrying it for 24 hours. He looked up. You were right. About my medication. About all of it. And the way they talked to you about being right was wrong. Mr. Fenwick, I'm not done, he said, not unkindly. I've been a letter carrier for 31 years. You know what I learned in 31 years? The people who actually know what they're doing usually have to prove it twice. Once to themselves and once to everyone else. And the proving it to everyone else part is the worst part, because you already know, and you have to watch people who don't know look at you like you're the one missing something. He stopped. You knew, you kept knowing, and then you went to the basement and got me. His daughter made a sound that she converted quickly into something quieter. Nora looked at him. Thank you, she said. It came out without the breath catch, without the stutter, clean and even. Not because the stutter was gone, it was never gone, but because some things were too direct to be complicated by mechanics. You take care of yourself, he said, and find somewhere that deserves you. I'm working on it, she said. What? The week that followed moved with the compressed, consequential speed of things that had been held in suspension for a long time and were now in motion. Gerald Vane was placed under federal investigation on the sixth day. The announcement was not public initially. Federal investigations rarely began with public announcements. But Fole called Nora on the evening of the sixth day to tell her, and she sat in her car outside the grocery store where she'd stopped on the way home, and held the phone and listened to him read the relevant section of the case filing in the even procedural voice of a man delivering a fact. The charge was evidence tampering in connection with a military operational review. Additional charges relating to the contracting fraud network were, Fole said, anticipated within 60 days. She thanked him. She bought her groceries. She went home and ate dinner and washed the dishes and stood at her kitchen window looking at the dark edge of the mountains and allowed herself for the first time to feel the full specific weight of what 8 years of carrying the wrong version of a story actually cost. Now that the cost had a number attached to it, and the number was being presented for payment by someone other than her, she didn't feel triumphant. She hadn't expected to feel triumphant. She felt something more like the relief of a joint that had been bearing weight at the wrong angle for so long that straightening it hurt in an entirely different way from the original injury. It was not a clean feeling. It was the right feeling. Schwab. Thursday came. She drove to Denver in the early morning, when the highway was still mostly trucks, and the mountains caught the first light in a way that made the drive feel like moving through something rather than simply across it. She had her coffee in the cup holder and a folder on the passenger seat that contained her service record, the supplemental finding that Webb had referenced, and 2 years of nursing documentation that Price had formally released to her the previous afternoon, with a letter on Caldwell Regional letterhead characterizing her clinical performance and language that was accurate and thorough and read like something written by someone who had looked at the record carefully rather than someone managing a liability. Colonel Adria Sten's facility was a converted veterinary research building on the western edge of the Denver metro, the kind of functional, unglamorous space that existed not to impress visitors but to do work. There was a parking lot, a main building, and behind it a series of structured outdoor areas that she could identify from the approach as exercise and training grounds. Sten met her in the entrance. She was smaller than her phone voice suggested, compact, with the efficient posture of someone who operated in spaces where posture was information. She was wearing civilian clothes rather than a uniform, which was either a deliberate choice about the nature of this meeting or simply a Thursday. "Vasquez," she said. "Sten," Nora said. They shook hands. "Coffee's in the conference room," Sten said. "We'll talk first. Then I want you to meet the animals." The conference room was functional and not unpleasant, with a long table and windows that looked onto the outdoor training area, where 2 handlers were running a standard obedience refresh with a young shepherd that had the elastic, overeager energy of an animal that hadn't yet learned to be economical with its effort. Sten poured coffee and sat across from her and said, "Tell me what you actually did at Fort Hawthorne. Not the file version, the version where you explain why it worked." Nora thought about how to answer that honestly. "The animals that came to the program," she said, "most of them had been trained their entire lives to function within a specific relationship. One handler, one set of commands, one operational context. When that relationship was severed, handler killed, handler injured, mission parameters changed, the animals didn't just lose a partner, they lost the structure that made their own behavior legible to them." She paused. Other specialists came in and tried to replace the relationship. New commands, new handler assignment, accelerated reintegration, and some of those animals responded to that. The ones who didn't, the ones who got sent to our program, were the ones whose trauma wasn't about the commands. It was about the trust underneath the commands. Sten was listening without performing listening, which Nora recognized as a quality. "You can't retrain trust," Nora continued. "You can't command it or condition it or accelerate it. You can only create conditions where it becomes possible, and then you have to wait." She looked at her coffee. "Most programs didn't have time for waiting. I had time because I made time, and I made time because I understood that the alternative was losing animals that were worth saving." "How did you know which ones were worth saving?" "All of them," she said. That was the methodology. All of them were worth saving. The calculation about which ones were worth the investment was someone else's call. My call was to treat them like the investment was already made. Sten was quiet for a moment. "The 2 animals I told you about on the phone," she said, "the ones at risk. I want you to meet them before I say anything else about them. I want your read before I give you mine." "Okay." "I want to be clear about what I'm asking you," Sten said. I'm not asking you to be a handler. I'm not asking you to replace the clinical program we have. We have good veterinary staff and good behavioral specialists, and they are doing what they know how to do. She folded her hands on the table. I'm asking you to do the thing that isn't in any protocol, the thing that's in your file, in what Vane tried to erase, and in every account I've received of what happened in Harwick last week. She met Nora's eyes. You notice. You stay. You're willing to sit in a difficult room and not need it to resolve on a schedule. Nora thought about Rook at 4 years old, the 11 days, the morning with the food bowl. What's the consultancy structure, she said. 2 days a week minimum. Denver or remote review depending on the week's needs. Salary commensurate with a senior federal civilian specialist classification, which I have already approved and which is not negotiable downward. Sten said this the way she said everything. Flat, clear, no decoration. Price tells me Caldwell Regional wants to maintain your clinical role in a reduced capacity. 3 days a week at Caldwell. 2 here. She did the arithmetic. That's a full week. Yes. I was already working full weeks. You were working full weeks and being treated like an auxiliary function, Sten said. This is different. This is 2 institutions that have read your file and understand what's in it. The difference mattered. Nora knew it mattered. She was just making sure she was honest with herself about the fact that she knew it, rather than performing reluctance for reasons she couldn't justify. Tell me about the 2 animals, she said. Their names, in the program's records, were listed as K9 unit designations, numbers and letters that were functional and said nothing. Nora looked at both files in the 10 minutes Sten gave her before walking her to the facility's north wing, and she made her own notes in the margins of the printouts, in the way she'd made notes on patient charts for 2 years, the shorthand that was legible only to her. The first animal was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, who had been withdrawn from active service following the death of his handler in a training accident 8 months ago. He had been through 2 handler assignment attempts. Both had failed. Not violently, not in any way that justified decommissioning in itself, but in the quiet way that failures of this type always happened, the animal simply declining, in some fundamental registral way, to accept the new relationship, going through the mechanical motions of compliance while remaining, at whatever level of consciousness animals occupied, entirely absent. He hadn't eaten consistently in 3 weeks. She knew that specific timeline because it was in the file and because Sten had mentioned it on the phone. She knew what it meant clinically, and she knew what it meant practically, and she knew what the review board was going to decide if it continued. The second animal was a German Shepherd, 9 years old, who had a different presentation. Not withdrawal, but hypervigilance. The kind that looked from a distance like readiness, but was in fact the opposite. An animal that couldn't distinguish between threat and safety anymore because the loss of her handler had collapsed the interpretive framework through which that distinction was made. She was operationally useless in her current state, and she knew it, which Nora was aware was an anthropomorphism that some behaviorists would object to, and which she stood by anyway. The north wing had kennels on both sides of a central corridor, warm enough, clean, with the specific smell of a well-maintained facility. 2 veterinary staff were present and nodded to Sten as she and Nora came through. The Malinois was in the 3rd kennel on the left. He was lying on his side, not sleeping. His eyes were open but not tracking the corridor, the 1,000-yard quality of an animal that had essentially decided that what the world was offering was not worth the energy of attention. Nora stopped outside the kennel. She didn't speak. She didn't crouch down, didn't make contact, didn't do any of the things that people did when they approached an animal they were trying to impress or calm or demonstrate their credentials to. She stood. She looked at him. He didn't look back. That was fine. She didn't need him to look back. She was not making a claim on his attention. She was simply present, in the hallway, at a distance that wasn't crowding and wasn't indifferent, the specific geometry of someone who had nowhere else to be. 40 seconds passed. His ear moved. One ear, rotating fractionally toward her in the way that an ear rotated when a sound had registered at the edge of relevance. Not compelling, but not nothing. He didn't lift his head. That was fine too. She stood there for another minute, and then she moved to the shepherd's kennel and did the same thing, and the shepherd was different. She came to the kennel door immediately, hyper-alert, scanning Nora with the rapid assessment of an animal running a constant threat inventory, and Nora held still and let her scan and didn't do anything to interrupt the process. After 20 seconds, the shepherd sneezed. It was the specific sudden sneeze that dogs produced when they had been in a high alert state and encountered something that didn't match the threat profile and the tension released through the nearest available physical channel. It was involuntary, and it was information. Nora took a breath. "I'll need to establish a schedule," she said, "and I'll need to know their individual food preferences and which handlers they've responded to least negatively, even if the responses were marginal." "We can have that for you today," Sten said. "Then yes," Nora said. "I'll take the consultancy." She drove back to Harwick in the late afternoon when the mountains went through the sequence of colors they went through when the sun was low. The improbable ones, the ones that didn't look real and were real anyway, orange and pink, and the specific shade of purple that existed only in that particular hour. She called Sandra on the hands-free and told her. Sandra said, "Good," with the conviction of someone who had been holding that word ready. She called Price's office and left a message with the assistant confirming the shared arrangement and asking about the transition timeline. She drove. She thought about Gus Fenwick, who was home now, in whatever the home of a man who had spent 31 years delivering mail to the same streets looked like. She thought about Harriet Voss in room 409, whose arrhythmia had stabilized and who had, according to the morning notes, described the events of Tuesday night to every nurse who came in, with increasing dramatic elaboration. She thought about Pauline Rast, who had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's review of her role, and whose situation was complicated in the way that situations were complicated when people made choices without understanding the full architecture of what they were contributing to. She didn't know what would happen to Pauline. She found she felt something toward her that was not quite sympathy and not quite its absence. She thought about Roland Speer in federal custody, navigating the specific degradations of cooperation agreements, his decades of careful network building unwinding in the accounting language of indictments and case filings. She thought about Gerald Vane, who had given speeches about listening and had buried an assessment that said, "Stop, this is not ready, something is wrong." She thought about what it meant that the thing Vane had needed to suppress, her voice, her clinical read, her willingness to say out loud what she observed, was the same thing that had unraveled him. Not because she had gone looking for him, because she had simply kept doing what she had always done, in a hospital in Montana, for 2 years, without knowing he existed, and the accumulation of that had produced a record that outlasted his interference. There was something in that worth sitting with. She had not been vindicated because she had fought. She had been vindicated because she had continued. Those were not the same thing, and the difference mattered to her in a way she was still working out the full shape of. 3 weeks later, Caldwell Regional held a staff recognition event. It was not a ceremony. Nobody called it a ceremony, because that would have implied a formality that the institution was still negotiating how to earn. It was a department meeting for the cardiac and emergency wings, with a section added at the end of the agenda. Price presented it, standing at the front of the conference room with the same directness she brought to every communication. No theater. She named the events of the Tuesday in October. She named the incident report filed before 6 a.m. and the documentation gap it had correctly identified. She named the liaison role, and the corridor identification, and the third floor, and the sub-basement. She named the role Nora had played in each. She did not present an award. She amended the record, formally, in the administrative system, in Nora's personnel file, to reflect, in institutional language, what the actual history of the last 2 years looked like when it was read accurately. Then she said, in the room, in front of the cardiac team and the emergency staff, and Gerald Oates, who was there for reasons of his own, and Sandra, who was standing near the back. Ms. Vasquez has been a member of this staff for 2 years. During that time, her clinical judgment has been consistently accurate and consistently undervalued. That is an institutional failure, not a personnel failure. I want everyone in this room to understand that distinction, because the personnel we get wrong, we can eventually correct. The institutional habits that allowed it to happen require the people in this room to change what they do every day. Croft was in the back row. He was looking at his hands. He looked up when Price finished, and he looked at Nora, and he gave a single, small nod that was not nothing. Brianna Locke was 3 seats from Nora. She didn't look sideways. She looked straight ahead. That was fine. Reckoning had different textures for different people, and Nora had long since stopped needing the particular texture that looked like what she was owed. After the meeting, in the corridor, 3 nurses she didn't know well came up and said things, brief things, the compressed acknowledgments of people who were not certain of what to say and said something anyway. She received each one without deflecting and without expanding it into something larger than it was. They were what they were. The Malinois ate on the 14th day. She wasn't there when it happened. She was at Caldwell Regional, on her Harwick days, checking a potassium drip in room 318, which had been running fast again with the specific inevitability of things that hadn't been properly fixed, and her phone buzzed with a text from the Denver facility's veterinary lead that said simply, "He ate. Full bowl." She was holding a syringe and she put her head down for a moment, not crying, just occupying the feeling, letting it be exactly the size it was. It was a large feeling. She recapped the syringe and updated the chart and moved to the next room. The shepherd took 3 more weeks. She was present that morning, a Saturday, not technically her Denver day, but she had rearranged the week because there had been indicators in the previous session that something was shifting, and she had learned in 8 years of dormancy and the weeks since reactivating that. The shift didn't announce itself, it simply arrived, and you needed to be in the room when it did. The shepherd ate, and then walked to the kennel door and stood there, looking down the corridor, and then looked at Nora. It was the specific look of an animal asking a question it didn't have language for. Nora sat down on the floor of the corridor, cross-legged, at the kennel door. She was not attempting to be anything in that moment. She was not a consultant or a nurse or a former specialist or a person who had been wronged and made right. She was someone sitting on a floor, available. The shepherd lay down on the other side of the kennel door with her nose an inch from the gap. They stayed like that for a while. The indictment of Gerald Vane was announced publicly 6 weeks after Spears' statement. It was covered in the national feeds for approximately 1 news cycle. Military contracting, fraud, and evidence tampering were not the kind of story that held attention for long. But it was covered, and his name was in it, and the specific detail that the buried assessment had been the work of a junior specialist whose record had been formally amended was in the 3rd paragraph of the Wire report. She read it on her phone in the hospital parking lot before her morning shift. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt the thing she had been slowly, carefully learning to feel, which was something closer to completion. Not because the story had a tidy ending. Vane would have lawyers and the process would be long and outcomes in federal cases were never certain. But because the facts were in the record now, in the specific permanent way that official documents were permanent, and the version of events that had been constructed to erase her had itself been erased, and what remained was accurate. What remained was, she had been right. She had told the truth. She had been overruled by people who had reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of her judgment. And she had kept working, and kept noticing, and kept filing the reports even when the reports were redirected, and the accumulation of that, over years and in ways she hadn't planned, had produced consequences she hadn't predicted and outcomes she hadn't expected, but that were, in the cold arithmetic of what the evidence showed, exactly what should have happened. She went inside. She checked the break room light. Someone had finally replaced the fixture. The flickering was gone, the light steady and ordinary above the door. She had been right that she'd stopped noticing it. She noticed it now only because of its absence. In December, 2 months after the Tuesday that had remade everything and nothing simultaneously, Nora stood in the outdoor training area of the Denver facility on a cold morning with the Malinois, whose name in the program records was Cade, which she'd adopted because the number letter designation felt insufficient for an animal she was spending this much time with, running a basic recall exercise that was not about the command. The command was a formality. The exercise was about the practice of choosing to return, over and over, until the choice became reflex, until the animal understood that the relationship held regardless of what happened in the interval between the departure and the return. He came back every time. He wasn't fully there yet, not in the deep way that working animals were fully there when they had completely rebuilt the architecture of trust. She could see the calculation still, the fraction of a second before each return where he assessed whether the return was worth the exposure. That fraction would narrow. It would narrow because she would be here, consistently, without requiring anything from him that he wasn't ready to give. She knew how long it took. She had always known. That had been her whole value, the thing they had tried to turn into a liability. Her knowledge that some things could not be rushed, and her willingness to not rush them. She thought about the nurses in the break room who had needed her to be quieter and faster and more frictionless. She thought about the doctors who had spoken over her in briefings. She thought about Vane, who had needed her assessment to not exist, who had made it not exist, and who was now in the formal possession of its consequences. She thought about what it cost a person to spend years accommodating other people's discomfort with the way they spoke. The specific daily erosion of it, the internal negotiation of which battles to choose and which to absorb, the accumulated weight of it carried without anyone seeing it as weight, because from the outside it looked like patience. It was patience. It was also cost. Those two things had always been true at the same time, and she had never had a space in which to say so. She had one now. Cade returned from the far end of the training area and sat in front of her, looking up. She crouched down. She looked at him. "Good," she said. One word, clean, without the catch. The word that meant what it said. He leaned forward very slightly. She put her hand on his head and felt him hold still, not with the rigidity of an animal in a guarded state, but with the particular stillness of one that has found something worth being still for. There were things she understood now that she hadn't understood clearly enough before, or had understood in the abstract without understanding in the body. That being dismissed was not proof of error. That the people in the room with the authority to decide what mattered were not always the people with the clearest view of what was actually happening. That a stutter was not a gap in thought. It was a delay in delivery, and delivery was not the content, no matter how many times institutions confused the two. That the measure of a person was not the speed at which they could get a room to listen. It was what happened when the room finally did. She had been that nurse, the one who struggled to finish sentences in a culture that valued finishing them fast. The one whose reports got redirected and whose assessments got buried, and whose voice was processed as a deficiency rather than a signal. She was still that nurse. She would always be that nurse, in every room she walked into, until the room understood what she was. And some rooms would never understand, and some would. And the difference was not her job to carry as a wound. It was her job to keep working, to keep noticing, to be in the room when the shift happened. Cade pressed his nose against her palm. She stayed on the ground with him in the cold December morning in Denver, the mountains visible to the west in the specific flat clarity of winter, enormous and indifferent and present. And she thought, this is what I know how to do, and I'm going to keep doing it. And anyone who ever needed me to be smaller than this was asking for something they had no right to. She had spent a long time making herself smaller. She was done with that particular accommodation. The people who measured her by the pauses between her words had been measuring the wrong thing all along. What was between the pauses was the part that mattered. It always had been.